25. To war we go. I was up just as the grey light of dawn began to filter into the cavernous hollow mountain. I had been given one of the rooms in Arya's apartments. It was a spacious, but simply decorated room with a lovely view of the white marble city. Bathed and dressed with a good night's sleep under my belt, it was hard to feel too grim about things. The previous day's afternoon had been a peaceful one spent with Murtagh and Saphira, and then Eragon when he returned from his visit with Angela. It had not been awkward in the slightest, but rather like the times we used to share before Gilead. We had talked of easy things and laughed over bad jokes. Ah, how I wished I could have paused time right there, and then for these quiet moments were rare. I wanted to treasure them forever, for of course, I might never get to experience them again. Shaking my head to clear my thoughts, I could not help but wonder how long until the battle began. Was this my last day of rest and preparation? I sighed and finished buckling my arm braces on, braided my hair back and moved towards the door. I was nearly at the door, already thinking of where I could wander, when I caught a glimpse of an unfamiliar face. I stopped, surprised, and realized that I was staring into a mirror and that there was not someone in my room. Have you ever gone months without seeing a clear reflection of your face? Have you lost your identity and been told to replace it with another? Have you come face to face with a face that you do not recognize, but is, in fact, yours? I moved closer to the mirror and stared at the perfectly clear reflection that stared back at me. Unconsciously, one hand rose and touched the smooth surface. The girl in the mirror copied the action. But how could the girl in the mirror be me? How could this beautiful, high cheekbone face, with no trace of lingering child roundness and innocence, be my own? Looking back at me was not a girl on the very edge of adulthood, but still clinging tightly to last vestiges of her childhood. This was a young woman with eyes shuttered and closed, a slender figure, and a proud look to her. Her hair had lost streaks of red and lighter brown, and was now a deep, rich dark mahogany that was nearly black. This girl had no splattering of freckles across her nose, nor did she have that wide-eyed, deer-in-the-headlight look to her or any softness to her jaw. Her battle with poison and illness had given her a slightly starved appearance, a slightly too thin face with a haunted set to her mouth. What had happened to the girl who would drop her eyes, who let her hair grow long so she could cover her face, and who hated her nose because it was too big? The face that looked back at me was cool and proud. It was the face of a young woman, grown and sure of herself, who had seen the world. It was very similar to the face of the woman I had seen in the throne room standing behind the king. This was me. This was the Zoe that traveled in the company of a dragon and her rider, had fought and killed, been imprisoned, survived a lethal poison, and was unlocking her blocked memories. I dropped my hand from the mirror and stared into my reflection. This was a crown princess, and this was me. There was something very final about seeing my face and staring to my eyes. I had changed, grown, and remembered. It showed. It showed upon my face, and it was such a change that I could not fully grasp it right then. Turning away, unable to continue examining myself, I left the room and walked back out into the main room. Arya's door was closed, but Murtagh's was open, suggesting that he had already left. Feeling restless, I left the rooms and began to wander down the hallways of the city, not really going anywhere. At last, after wandering through many empty corridors and gardens, I found myself standing on an open balcony that overlooked the central chamber. I had seen no one on my walk, and I wondered if the Varden's women and children had already left in preparation for the upcoming battle. I vaguely remembered Arya telling me something of the sort, and it would make sense that they would leave now along with the dwarves who would not be fighting. I glanced up at the shimmering rose jewel and wondered if Eragon was awake yet, and whether or not I should contact him mentally. My musings were interrupted when I heard the soft sounds of someone walking not far away. Keeping myself relaxed, I turned and saw a dark-skinned, black-haired woman walking towards me from the opposite direction. She was reading some papers as she walked. There was only one person she could be, Naswada, daughter of Ajahad. Perhaps, if things went as I had read they would, this would be the next leader of this entire army. Her face, while furrowed in concentration, was proud and striking, but there was something almost bitter about her. A kind of bitterness, as if this striking lady longed for another life, and yet had been stifled her entire life and forced to remain in the shadows, while others claimed glory for themselves. A bright red apple, appearing shiny and at the full bloom on first glance, but in reality it was rotten at the core. Naswada did not notice me until she was a few feet away, and when she did, she stopped dead, and one hand went immediately to the jeweled dagger hanging decoratively at her side. I could not help but smile, amused at the thought of a small ceremonial dagger challenging my own sword. It would be a fight to remember. Keeping my smile, I said, "Good morning." Naswada recovered herself and said, "Good morning. I do not believe we have met, my lady." "No," I said, "but my name is Zoe, and you must be the Lady Naswada." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded and moved a little closer, shifting the papers in her hands, and said, "Of course. It is an honor to meet you." I just smiled slightly and asked, "The city seems quiet this morning." "Yes," agreed Naswada. "Many have already left for the valleys close by until the upcoming battle is decided. They are accompanied by a few warriors, but not enough to offer any kind of protection if the Urgles did move to attack them." Turning back to look out over the empty chamber, I asked, "Will you go?" I already knew her feelings on the matter, but I wanted to hear the words spoken by her. I did not want to be left to my nervous mind, which was conjuring up images of Urgles, blood, fighting, and above all, death. Death upon death and more death. Naswada bit her lip and moved closer until she was standing beside me. "I do not wish to go, but my father wants me to." I raised an eyebrow and met her hard eyes. "So, will you obey your father or the desires of your heart?" Looking away from me, Naswada ran a hand along the smooth stone of the balcony, while the other pressed the papers tightly against her chest, making them crinkle. "I do not know. You are lucky, my lady." She paused and looked at me closely as if to pull answers out of me. "No one would demand you leave. You have earned both my father and the Varden's respect. You can stay and fight for those you care about, while I must be safely sent away." I heard the note of bitterness mixed with anger. It confirmed my suspicions. The Lady of the Varden was desperate to prove herself, not only to her father, but to the people she considered her own. We were similar, the two of us, in our wish to fight for those we cared for, but very different too. She was more courageous than I and more sure of what she wanted in this world. I sighed and looked away from the woman beside me. There is no shame in not fighting, Naswada. No shame at all. Yet I know where you're coming from. I too had to struggle against those who felt that a woman's place was at home and not on the battlefield. Naswada opened her mouth to speak, but I shook my head and continued. "Know this, my lady. If you feel that your reasons for fighting are just, then I encourage you to act on them. If you are skilled enough to protect not only yourself, but those you fit for, then remain. However, if your reasons are founded on pride and the desire to prove yourself, then you would be more useful helping the women and children who will be losing loved ones in this battle." Silence fell between us, and Naswada refused to meet my gaze. When she spoke again, her words had a hard edge to them, though they were still polite. "Your words are true, my lady, and I will consider them, but—" Here she paused again, and I wondered if she was blushing. There was a faint color in her cheeks that could only mean she felt squeamish about something, but what could it be? "Did Lord Murtagh tell you that I spoke with him yesterday?" It was such a non sequitur that I blinked in surprise before saying, "No, no, he didn't." "Why? What did he say?" I inwardly groaned at the thought that Murtagh had said something completely inappropriate to the daughter of Ajahad, because he was in a bad mood. My father bid me to speak with him in the hopes that he would feel more welcomed by the Varden, but I fear that I may have made him feel as if I was trying to discover more than I really was. He mentioned that he was to meet you, and I merely wondered if he mentioned our conversation. I would ask you whether or not I should apologize to him. I had to restrain myself from snorting in amusement. Apologize to Murtagh? Ah, that would be interesting, but I did not say that. Instead, I shrugged and said, "Murtagh is wary, and I would not take it personally." Added natural mistrust is worry for the upcoming battle. You can apologize to him if you want and see what he does. He is kind under the surface and loyal to the end. As for him not mentioning your conversation, it is not surprising. We had other things to speak of, and Murtagh may not have wanted to discuss it with Iragan, Saphira, and I. Naswada nodded and then said, "I must go. My father needs my assistance. One more thing. I said before she could leave. If you do stay for this battle, then find me. I would like to know your choice one way or the other. Why? Asked Naswada. You wouldn't tell my father, would you? I laughed lightly at the suspicion in her voice and the slight narrowing of her eyes as she gazed at me. No, I mean nothing of the kind. I ask that of you because this is going to be your first battle, and I would rather know to keep an eye out for you before the battle begins than halfway through it. My smile disarmed the last of her defenses, and she gave me a true smile, the tense worry in her face easing a little as she relaxed. Ah, she said, I will let you know. With that, she left, and I turned back to look over the central chamber. My heart fluttered uneasily in my chest as I considered what was waiting in my future. Gripping the hilt of my sword tightly, I left the balcony and retraced my steps to my room. Perhaps I could discover where breakfast was not that I really felt like eating. Or even better, I could go visit my poor mare. I had neglected her these last few weeks, and I could only hope she would find it in her heart to forgive me. My steps speeding up, I asked a passing dwarf for directions and made my way to the stables. A day spent with my horse was a day well spent in my books. Brahm stopped in front of an open window that overlooked the entire city. The women and children had gone early that morning, and the dwarves were currently preparing for the battle. Windows were being barred, traps were being set down tunnels, and the first few streets, walls and gates were being fortified, and warriors readied. I am old, thought Brahm as he regarded the unfolding scene before him, and I have seen many things, but this battle will be the start of something I have never seen or planned on seeing. This battle will be the first of many. Sighing, the man dropped his head and took a few steadying breaths. War was the only way. They had exhausted all other paths. This he knew, but he despised it. He hated the thought of sending his only son into the all-out carnage of battle, and yet he must, for his son was now a rider. For good or ill, Iragan was a crucial part of the upcoming storm. It was for his sake that so many would die and sacrifice not only themselves, but their families. How he wished, as a father, that he had never gone to Carvajal, and that his son would never have been forced to raise a sword. As a father, he had failed in the most basic of ways, to keep his son safe. Trying to clear his mind of the poisonous thoughts, Brahm turned and began to walk down the empty, white marble corridor. The hours of idleness leading up to a battle were the worst, and the old storyteller knew that all too well. With nowhere to be, no one to see, and nowhere in particular he should go, Brahm chose the only place he was certain he would not be disturbed, the library. He could lose himself in the words of some old tome in a quiet corner of the library and leave the dealings of the Varden to its current leader. It was times like this that he was glad he had refused to continue leading the organization, and times like this that he wished they had never needed to begin it. He wished that Zoe had come before the fall, had stopped Galbatorix long before he began his vicious path of revenge that left the land saturated in blood and rage. Brahm could hear the sounds already and smell the hot blood and smoke. A shiver raced down his spine. Soon, too soon, and yet not soon enough. Saphira woke Iragan with a sharp rap of her snout, bruising him with her hard jaw. Ouch, he exclaimed, sitting upright. The cave was dark except for the faint glow emanating from the shuttered lantern. Zoe has just sent for us. We are to meet them in Ajihad's study. Auric is waiting for us. Did she say anything else? Asked Iragan as he rubbed the bruise on his forehead. Talk about rude awakening, he thought irritably as he forced his body up. Just that you should come armed, and that the time for battle is almost upon us. Understanding immediately, Iragan leapt to his feet as all thoughts of irritation and sleep vanished from him. As quickly as he could, he dressed and belted his sword on as well as his bow and quiver. He could not help the yawn that escaped him as Saphira launched herself from the cave and spiraled down to the central chamber where Auric, tapping his axe anxiously against the marble floor, was waiting for them. The dwarf looked tense, and his craggy face was fixed in a dark frown. Come, the others are waiting. He led them through Trondheim to Ajihad's study. Nothing was said between the three. They knew what would be discussed in the study and what it would mean, and they saw no reason to speak of it unnecessarily. The large study door was opened by a pair of burly guards who, like always, made no sign of acknowledgement as the three passed inside. Ajihad stood behind his desk, bleakly inspecting a map with Brahm. Arya and a man with wiry arms were there as well, both armed and looking grim-faced. Both Zoe and Murtagh were standing beside them looking equally grim, and Zoe, her face still bearing signs of her long illness, was looking particularly worn and haunted. Ajahad looked up as they entered. "Good, you're here, Iragan. Meet Yermandur, my second in command." They acknowledged each other, and Zoe gave him a warm smile that faltered in the chilly, tense air of the study, but then all attention was turned back to Ajahad. The silence in the room was oppressive. The man, leaning heavily against the desk, spoke in a low monotone. "A dwarven sentry has just returned from scouting. He was injured, but he was able to tell us that an army of Urgles was on its way here. It is maybe a day's march away, but no less. We have been preparing for this, but we did not know exactly when or how they would come." Yermunder swore under his breath, but everyone else was silent as they watched the man at the desk. Ajahad continued, gesturing at the map as he continued to explain. "The Urgles are not approaching over land, but under it. They're in the tunnels. We're going to be attacked from below." Again, silence met Ajahad's words, but it was broken by Zoe. "Then we should prepare for them." Her voice was firm, and she seemed the only one not frozen in place by the information that had just been delivered with such finality by Ajahad. Moving forward, the girl traced a finger along a line that represented a tunnel. "If we force them to surface in a few locations, then we can more easily contain them and prevent them from entering the city by breaking the floor. Do you have an estimate on their numbers?" Ajahad looked at her carefully. "No," he said at last. "I am not even sure that there are troops with them or not. If Galbatorix has augmented the Urgle's ranks with his own men, then we don't stand a chance. But if hasn't, then we might be able to succeed. We are alone in this battle with no reinforcements either from other dwarf cities, Orin, or from the elves. As for the battle plan, you are correct, my lady. We are going to collapse select tunnels, but the task is too big for normal means. Two groups of dwarves are already working on it, one outside Trondheim, the other beneath it. Iragan, you are to work with the group outside. Arya, you'll be with the one underground. Auric will guide you to them." Iragan nodded in understanding, and with that Arya and Saphira left the study with Auric. He did not glance back, though he could feel Brahm's heavy gaze upon him. Before the battle began, he would have to speak with his father, but not then. Iragan was unsure what to say or if anything should be said. Sighing, the young rider wondered what was going to happen now. The fate of the entire Varden rested on them now. Neither the elves nor Serda could come to their aid now. No, they were alone in this fight, and Iragan was painfully aware of how small their forces were. This would be a hard battle, and even worse, it would be his first. The very idea sent stabs of fear into his chest. He had never had the chance to anticipate a fight before, and now that he did, it filled him with cold dread. One hand automatically came up and rested against Saphira's warm side as they moved through the echoing halls. "We are alone, Saphira." "Never alone," she replied. "We are never alone." When Iragan and the others left, Ajahad turned to look at Yermunder and Murtagh, who waited at attention for orders. "Yermunder, ready the men to fight." "Murtagh, you know your own skills best, but perhaps you can assist in outfitting the men for battle." Murtagh gave a short, brisk nod and said, "I can assist in that." Ajahad waved a hand and said, "Then go." With that, the two left. Thought Murtagh glanced back at me briefly before following Yermunder out of the room. I turned back and met the steely gaze of the man in front of me. Brahm stood silently beside Ajahad, and I wondered what his thoughts were. His face was set in a grim mask that betrayed nothing. Only the way his eyes had lingered on Iragan and Saphira as they left had given me any indication of how worried he truly was for the rider. In a soft, dangerous voice, Ajahad snapped me back to the present. "Is there anything you will tell me about this battle, or will you send us into it with nothing but blind faith?" I sighed, but controlled my irritation, for Ajahad's words were justified, and already I could see that he was planning his people's final funeral. He did not expect to live through the next night. He did not expect many of his men, if any of them, to live to the following evening, and it was tearing at him just as it would tear at any other commander. "What can I tell you?" I asked gently. "From what I know, there are no troops with the Urgles. I suspect that Durza will be involved in this fight." I looked down at the map. I also suspect that, if he can be destroyed, then Urgle forces will splinter without the aid of the Shade's magic to hold them together. If I know anything of the shade, then I would say that Durza will not lead the charge, for it is not his favored style of fighting, but rather come when the Varden has been weakened by the Urgles. When Aragon has been weakened, and he can capture the rider and dragon easily and with little effort, he shall wait till then. He shall wait until our men have spent themselves, and there is no one strong enough to stand between him and his prize. You know this, Ajahad. You know this, and you do not need me to tell you. Ajahad's gaze softened a little, and he turned back to the map. You agree with the plan, then? I shrugged and said, I can see no other options. You cannot let the Urgles break into the city, but neither do you have enough men to guard the entire perimeter. The only thing I suggest is to plant traps at the entrance of each tunnel in the hopes you can kill as many without killing your own men in open combat. Ajahad was watching me curiously. You have fought in a battle before. I grimaced as memories skirted through my head briefly and too quickly for me to clearly see them. My words purposely vague, I said simply, I have fought enough and spent a great deal of time with those who have. Brahm's eyes opened a little in surprise, and I wondered how long it would be before he demanded an explanation. Not long, I thought wryly. That old man hated people keeping secrets from him, despite the number he kept. Ajahad just nodded and said, Where do you feel you would be most useful? I will join Murtagh. After a curt, dismissive nod, I left the room and began to walk down the empty corridors that seemed to emit a faint chill. The coldness made me shiver, and my footsteps unconsciously quickened. Murtagh would be in the armory fitting men, and I needed something to do or I would lose my mind completely. I was at the end of the corridor when, to my utmost surprise, an arm suddenly reached out and grabbed my upper arm, yanking me into an empty study. I struggled, but a familiar voice said, Stop, it's me. I did stop, more like froze, and stared at the hooded figure as I searched for some distinctive feature to confirm that it was who I thought it was. The figure, after a brief moment of hesitation, pushed the hood of the cloak back a little to reveal the dark skin and brown eyes of Naswada. What do you think you are doing? I demanded. I was furious that I had just been grabbed and yanked into a dusty, unused study by this girl. Well, perhaps I should call her young woman, but I was hardly impressed by this attempt at secrecy. SHHH, whispered Naswada, glancing at the door as if she feared her father was going to be bursting in any moment in the next few. You asked me to tell me if I would stay, and I will. Right, I said, my anger dissipating as quickly as it had come. Well, thank you for telling me. Where will you be posted? Her hands twisted nervously before her, with the archers. I nodded and glanced at the window and noticed men beginning to gather at the front gates of the city mountain. That is safe enough for your first battle, I suppose. She gave a weak smile, and meeting her gaze, I said with a gesture towards the window, I need to go, and so do you. I tried to smile a little but failed. Smiling just does not work when you are in these sorts of situations, so instead, I gave her half embrace and left the room before hurrying down the corridors toward the armory which was located beside the main gates of the city. I found Murtagh using a piece of string to measure men and fit them with the correct sized weapons and armor. He glanced up briefly when I entered and asked, what did he want? Just to ask if there was anything I could add to what was already said. I took a half seat on the edge of a table laden with swords. And, asked Murtagh, as he passed the man he had been assisting a spear, and then gestured at the next one in line. I shrugged. I couldn't add much. What happens in this battle is beyond my control. Not that any of it really is in my control, Murtagh. I just like to pretend it is because pretending such things is easier than saying they are so out of my control that I don't know what to do. Murtagh nodded and directed the man before him towards a row of shields and plate armor. Want to help? Love to, I said, and gratefully accepted a piece of string from Murtagh. Before long, any chance at having a conversation with Murtagh was lost, as we found the Varden's soldiers their weapons and armor. I also spoke with many of them, for they seemed kind and honest. Meeting them and speaking with them made my heart ache, for of course, many of these men would not survive the following day. Not only that, but many of them were married and spoke proudly of their children, their eyes glinting with fatherly pride when I inquired. My memories had returned enough for me to remember similar conversations with men in my father's, and then my brother's army. Many of those men had been similar to the ones who came to me for the weapons now. I almost felt as if I had been transported back to those times when it had been not been Murtagh helping match weapons and armor, but Eamund or Pethard or one of my cousins. What would dear brothers have said if they could see me now? What would they have said? Or any one of the many lords and advisors I had dealt with back home? I don't know what they would have said. I did not remember enough to know, and that hurt worst of all. At long last, after many hours of constant motion back and forth through the tent, the lines of warriors ceased, and I was able to sit down on a now emptied table. Murtagh joined me, and we sat in silence, both forced to remember what we were preparing for. The constant motion had eased the worry, and now it came back full force. I glanced around and saw a number of dwarves gathering at the entrance to Trondheim. They were dressed in heavy battle gear with burnished steel hauberks, thick round shields stamped with the crests of their clan, and short swords at their waists. In their hands they carried mattocks or war axes, heavy things that made me cringe slightly just to look at them. There was no grace in the way a dwarf fought, only brute strength and heavy swings. It works, and that is the only thing that matters in the end. You just have to get through it. Heroic deeds, and all that is usually the last thing in your mind, because those deeply ingrained survival instincts come out full force. You're not thinking of saving the day or being sung of in songs, but instead of living to see the dawn and taking another breath, allowing your heart to beat for a little longer. Suddenly Murtagh spoke. I suppose we should get ourselves ready. His words hung in the air and seemed to echo through the now empty room. Neither of us wanted to move. Neither of us wanted to act or come any close to what was coming, but we had no choice. Yes, I said, but made no move to leave. Summoning the shreds of my pitiful courage, I stood and said, I'm going to go find something to eat and then try and find some armor. I suppose I'll also have to go get Melinlas too. My words seemed to break the spell that had settled over the two of us. Good idea, said Murtagh, and with that we separated, with Murtagh going back to the rooms we shared with Arya for his weapons, and me going off to locate some armor that would actually fit. I found it quite by accident, and only because of Auric. I had paused to speak with Eragon and Saphira, who had just finished collapsing the last of tunnels, and mentioned my need for proper fighting gear. Auric had smiled and said, Don't you worry about that, girl. King Hrothgar has had his treasury searched for suitable armor for both you and Eragon. Along with human armor, we discovered a full set of dragon armor, which is exceedingly rare. The dwarf was clad like his kin, and his own war axe was strapped across his back. Saphira had been more than exceedingly pleased to hear that, and even more pleased when she saw the armor. It was silver with golden scroll work along the edges, and after a great deal of swearing, tugging and pulling, the three of us managed to get it all on her. I will admit, a dragon in armor is more terrifying than they have any right to be. The armor protected Saphira from the tip of her nose to very tip of her tail. It had been designed so that Saphira had full range of motion, but it would still protect her softer underbelly and sides from the jagged weapons that the Urgles wielded. Well, she asked, how do I look? Terrifying, I said sincerely. Truly terrifying. I would hate to be on the wrong side of you, Saphira. This made her give a rather large, toothy dragon smile which fully exposed all her shining white and very large teeth. I winced. So would I, said Auric under his breath. I smiled in amusement and shared a glance with Eragon, who looked like he was struggling not to laugh, but managed to cover it with a few well-placed coughs. I didn't know they made armor for dragons, said Eragon. Full sets are rare because dragons keep growing, explained Auric. This set has languished in the treasury for centuries, but it will serve you well, Saphira, or at least until you outgrow it. But at least it fits you now, can't have you going into battle unprotected. With that, the dwarf clapped his hands and turned to the smaller piles of metal that had been brought with the dragon armor. These are for you too. Hrothgar knew that both of you would need to be suitably outfitted for the battle, and so these were found. I moved forward curiously. Why would Hrothgar send armor for me? I asked. We haven't even met. Ah, said Auric with a mysterious smile, but he has heard of you, and I wouldn't be surprised if Bram informed him of your need as well. You have become rather famous among the Varden, Zoe, and even the dwarves speak of you. I coloured slightly in embarrassment as Eragon elbowed me in the ribs. In a teasing voice he said, Famous Zoe, you. I elbowed him right back and muttered, "You're not one to talk, Ryder." He just shook his head and began to examine his new armor. My own was simple in design and surprisingly light all considering. It was made out of unpolished metal that had little design on it, just the way I wanted my armor to be. I held it up so I could examine it, and I could not help but wonder whether or not I wanted to wear the whole shebang. It would be very heavy by the end of the battle, no matter how light it felt now, and from the faint memories I could recall, I had never liked fighting in all-out armor. No, I would wear the basic parts like the shoulder guards and thin, leather-backed mail shirt, but leave the chest plate, greaves, and the helm. Heavy battle gear would only hinder me as the fight dragged on. I am only girl after all, and I can only cart around so much. I slipped my black leather overshirt off and unbuckled my arm braces as I donned the mail shirt, which fell to mid-thigh over that went my leather overshirt jacket design that I had had since arriving in Alagaesia, and then my braces, the shoulder guards, and then my weapons. I had collected a few knives as well from the armory. One went up my arm bracer, another in my boot, and a third was slipped in my belt in easy reach. With my weapons firmly strapped on, a green cloak fastened over my shoulders and my light armor, I felt ready for what was to come. The comforting weight of my hunting horn at my hip made me feel slightly better. When I say I felt ready for what was to come, well, to be honest, I am not. I will never be ready, but time was running out, and we were speeding onwards. Once I was ready, I looked over at Iragan. His armor was bright with a gold and silver helm, leather-backed mail, and then a broad shield emblazoned with an oak tree. He gave me a tense smile and said, "Well, did I put it on right?" I appreciated his attempts at levity, at finding something worth smiling about right then. "I suppose so," I said, rolling my eyes as I played along with it, "but only because of Auric." The dwarf gave a hearty chuckle as he gathered up the remains of my armor and sent them off with another dwarf. Iragan gave Auric a small bow and said, "Thank you for these gifts. They could not come at a better time." "Indeed," I said gratefully. "I did not relish the idea of going into battle with nothing on." "Wait till it saves your life," said Auric with a small smile. "Then you can say thank you." With that, he left to oversee his kinsmen in the fortifications being built for the archers. Groups of armed men were already preparing the traps that would be set around the entrances of the tunnels where the Urgles would be forced up. It was then that Murtagh appeared. He was dressed in plain Varden armor and was leading two horses. One was Tornak and the other was Melinla's. My mare was saddled and bridled. She was sporting a thin plate of armor across her broad forehead, which continued down to her nose. It would offer a little protection to my brave mare. I smiled and gratefully accepted the reins from Murtagh. "Thank you," I said. He nodded and greeted Iragan and Saphira before saying, "I met Brahm, and he informed me that Ajahad is looking for you, Iragan, Saphira. He is over by the main gates." "Right," said Iragan before heading off with Saphira. I glanced around, looking for a familiar face, but finding only the grim faces of the warriors and dwarves. Murtagh shook his head and said, "I don't know if we're going to survive this, Zoe." "Don't say that," I snapped. "We will, we have to, Murtagh. Now come on, I want to find out where we are supposed to go." With that, I led my mare with Murtagh trailing behind over towards where Ajahad was rumored to be. I met him and Brahm halfway there. "Zoe," said Brahm with a grim smile. "Murtagh, we were just looking for you." "Yes," said Ajahad. "Iragan has informed me that you, Zoe, and you, Murtagh, are able to communicate through your minds. During this battle, that skill will be of key importance, and so we have created a system where Brahm will direct you from inside Trondheim. He will send you where you are most needed or warn you if he feels you need it." We both nodded in understanding, and I breathed a small sigh of relief. At least I did not have to worry about Brahm in this fight. Brahm began to speak. "The two of you will be with Iragan at the third tunnel under Yermunder's command. Arya will also join you." "Anything else?" I asked. "No," said Ajahad, "only to thank the two of you for your assistance." Murtagh inclined his head and said, "Speak not of it, my lord." I nodded and said, "Indeed, much relies on this battle, and the Varden will have to survive this. This battle will decide the fate of many things." Ajahad nodded, and Brahm said grimly, "Yes, we will have to survive this. We must." I wondered at his choice of words, so similar were they to the ones I had spoken to Murtagh only a few minutes before. With that, the two left, and Murtagh and I made our way over to where we could see Saphira crouched. Iragan was sitting beside her, and Arya was not too far away along with Auric. My heart was a little lighter to see them, and to know that at least a few friends would be beside me in this. I took a seat by Saphira, holding Melinla's as I waited. The men gradually took their places, and silence fell over Farthen Dur, broken only by the occasional whinny of a horse, the crackle of flames, or the sound of whetstone against steel. No one spoke. A memory drifted across my vision. I was standing in front of a brightly colored tent in the middle of a forest of tents. Soldiers, horses, carts, and the occasional dwarf passed in front of me, but I paid them no mind. A gentle hand reached out and gripped my shoulder, turning me to face my younger sister, Lucia. Her face was worn, dark shadows under her eyes belied her weariness, and her simple dress was stained with blood, dirt, and who knows what else. She had been in the healing tent, and her face bore the sadness that came from watching too many slip away as you held their hand and told them to think of bright, good things as their life drained away. "It will be all right, Zoe. Just keep the faith." Shook my head, and Lucia's hand tightened on my shoulder. "How can it be all right, Lou? How? Father is dead. Pether does not believe he can lead an army, and Eamund has already lost hope. He is right. We cannot win this war. We cannot." My voice, too low for the soldiers walking past to hear, shook with emotion. Lucia shook her head firmly. "Have you forgotten your vows as a daughter of Angard? You swore never to give up, and above all to never give up hope. We are their last chance. We cannot give up. Ever." I gazed at her, hopelessness drowning out any feeling of hope. Lucia saw this, and suddenly she raised both hands to my face, gripping it tightly, and her voice shook with its intensity. "We can do it, Zoe. We can so believe in it. Believe in the men, and above all in you. Pethod is strong, and he will lead as will Eamund. A bright new dawn will come again, and there will be no need for war or death." My vision cleared, and I was left staring at the dark, gaping mouth of the tunnel with a line of sharpened stakes in front of it. I longed for my sister, for my brothers, for my home. It was an overwhelming feeling, and it took all my strength, all my willpower to force it away. I was here. I was in Alagaesia, and that was how it would be for a while yet. I had friends here who I loved deeply and who I would die to save, and in time I would go home. I would, and there was no point getting lost in homesickness for a place that I was only beginning to remember. But it was hard to think like that in the still silence of the battlefield that became increasing hot and oppressive. It was hard to not give in to my feelings of homesickness and self-doubt. I could not sleep like Iragan or Murtagh or many of the other men. Instead, I remained perfectly alert, along with Arya and Saphira. Melinla's also remained very still, except for the occasional swish of her tail as she batted away an annoying fly. I almost wanted to talk with Arya or Saphira or even Auric, but at the same time, I did not, and so I was left staring at the tunnel along with every man in this company of warriors. Time seemed to have slowed, and even breathing in the hot, heavy air seemed to slow. The occasional movement or suspicious sound would send a few warriors to their feet, but it always proved false and sent them back to their positions. Apart from these brief moments, nothing happened. Nothing, and that was the worst part. The waiting is always the worst. The wondering if you should be treasuring each and every breath you take because it might be your last. They say knowledge is power, but in the time before battle begins, the time between preparation and the actually fighting, knowledge is a curse. At long last, a dwarven scout ran out of the tunnel. He did not need to say anything, for his very presence and bloody axe was enough. Knowing what was happening, I surged to my feet as Saphira and Arya woke the others. I paused before mounting my mare, feeling the need to prepare her for what was coming, while everyone around me readied themselves and their weapons for coming carnage. Already I could hear the sounds of heavy feet and feel the vibrations of the urgles through the soles of my boots, but for a second I found a moment of total peace of quiet as my mind slowed, and I took a deep breath. Resting a hand on my mare's dark neck, I whispered softly into her ear, "I promise you, Melinlas, with everything I am, that I will do all I can for you in this battle." The mare snorted almost as if she was agreeing to the same thing for me, and with that, I mounted and turned my attention back to the tunnel. It was time. Beside me, face set, Iragan had mounted Saphira and drawn his bow. Murtagh was already on Tornak while Arya, standing straight and tall, watched the tunnel. Auric, a little ways away, had his giant axe held ready. I readied my bow as a few soldiers prepared torches for the welcoming trap the Varden and dwarves had prepared. As I notched an arrow to my bow, I could not help but glance up at the starless dome of Farthen Dur. I longed for a single bright star at the very least to take comfort in before this began, but all I could see was the heavy shadows of the hollow mountain. I sighed and turned my gaze back to the tunnel as the sounds of Urgel's bellowing reached my ears. It was time, for good or for ill, for the first battle of this rebellion. Who knew how it would end, but either way, I would do what I could. The ground shook, and I closed my eyes briefly as adrenaline began to run through me, hot and welcoming to my numb, terrified heart. Don't run, little warrior. Draw you blade and fight. Keep smiling in the shadow of the sun. Revised 1/27/2013. Enjoy. 26. The Battle of Farthen Dur. It has begun, said Arya softly. Yes, it had begun, and there was no point saying it over and over in the hope that it would suddenly stop. I could see the bulky shapes of Urgles in the shadowy tunnel entrance and the glint of the torches on their weapons. It wouldn't be long now. A kind of relief spread through me because, after thinking about this and wondering about it constantly, it would finally begin and the outcome would be decided. At a command from Jarmunder, the cauldrons of pitch were titled on their sides, pouring the scalding liquid into the tunnel's gaping mouth. The Urgles howled in pain, arms flailing. A torch was thrown onto the bubbling pitch, and an orange pillar of greasy flames roared up in the opening, engulfing the Urgles in an inferno. The sight, the sounds, and the smell made me almost throw up over my mare's shoulder. Poor Melinlas snorted and danced backwards from the heat of the flames. The smell of burning flesh was sickening, and the Urgle screams painful to hear. A quick glance around told me that this had happened at all the two other tunnels. It did not take long for the Urgles to overcome this particular hurdle. They quickly tamped the pitch down and clambered out over the charred bodies of their fallen companions, all the while bellowing for revenge. Behind the palisade of sharpened sticks, archers began to fire, and I added my own arrows to theirs. The arrows found their mark, and for a minute the Urgles could do nothing but raise their shields and cower together as the arrows showered down. The solid line of Urgles wavered, threatening to break, but they covered themselves with their shields and weathered the attack. Again and again we fired, but the Urgles continued to stream onto the surface at a very frightening rate. I gave up wasting arrows and slipped my bow away, choosing to draw my sword instead. Hand brushed against my horn, and a little flicker of warmth spread up through my arm. At least I had my horn if things got desperate, and they very well might. I watched, disgusted and frightened, as the Urgles charged forward only to be dashed against the first row of stakes, covering them with slick blood and limp corpses. A few Urgles fired arrows, but I was too far back to be harmed by the deadly rain. Iragan and Saphira, who were closer to the front of the lines, were not affected overly much either. It did not take long before the horde of Urgles overcame the pickets and swarmed forward. Now it was the Varden's turn to bunch together as if hoping this would make us harder to kill. For a moment things seemed to slow down. The Urgles charged forward. Stop. The men at the front raised their spears to form a thorny wall of spears. Stop. Sound dies down. Stop. The seconds drag on. Stop. Then, suddenly, everything speeds back up, and with a deafening crash, the main bodies of the two opposing armies clashed together, and we were forced into the fight. Things were complete mayhem from then on out. The things I remember of that fight are the small details. They are the strange little things that my adrenaline-fueled brain caught onto. Fire glinting on a curved Urgle blade as it was raised to deliver a killing blow. A young Varden soldier, his eyes wide with terror, as he passed by me with the shattered haft of a spear clutched in one hand. The bright red blood that flecked Melinlas's coat as she lunged forward after a deadly exchange of blows. The dangerously sharp points of an Urgle's horn as he lowered them at me, roaring his challenge. The feeling of sweat mixing with blood running into my eyes and making them burn. You may have heard that battle is confusion and endless fighting that seems to have no beginning and no end. You may have heard that the only time we can make some sort of sense out of the carnage and pain is in nightmares that haunt us until our dying day. That's all got a grain of truth to it, but battle is more than that. You cannot hope to explain it so simply. You can hope to understand it a little when you ask a soldier and see his eyes cloud, his hands unconsciously tighten, and his face grow cold. To really understand battle, to know what it really feels like. Well, the deepest understanding of something comes from living and doing. Battle is one of those things. It is everywhere. It is in books, songs, and in our own individual pasts, for all of us knows someone or has some long-dead ancestor who fought in some battle or another. Battle fills a person with wild fear that speeds up your reactions, sharpens your senses, and makes you feel like you have just been plugged into an electric socket. Battle is sound. It is motion. It is the ache of small wounds. It is the exhaustion that begins to take its toll on your body because the adrenaline is draining. It is your mind desperately trying to process what is happening, and it is something you can never forget or quite explain afterwards. It is something apart from everything else. I spin my sword, blocking an Urgel's club as I urged Melinla's forward so I could finish this duel and turn to another opponent. With one Urgel down and another few hundred ready to take his place, I wearily stroked my sweaty mare briefly. I needed a brief moment to catch my breath. We had been fighting for over 2 hours, and there was no sign that it would slow down any time soon. With a small nudge, I moved my mare forwards and managed to take a few deep, steadying breaths before I was forced back into the fight when a cull decided to try and decapitate me. I was halfway through finishing him, and at the same time, another Urgle off when I found myself fighting alongside a young man mounted on a brown charger. He was about my age, maybe a year or two older. He was obviously terrified, but he managed a brief smile in my direction. I returned it and remained by his side until there was another break in the fighting. He was a decent fighter, but battle is a game of luck and chance. You could be as skilled as Arya and still end up dead on the ground. I could end up dead on the ground. We all could. You all right? I asked him. What a silly question. Of course he wasn't all right, and neither was I, but the niceties of civilized society had not left me yet even this place and time. He nodded. As all right as I can be, my lady. The battle carried on around us, but for a blessed moment we were not part of it. It was like we were surrounded by some sort of invisible, protective bubble. My heart rate slowed a little, and I was able to wipe some of the sweat from my forehead. I shifted my sword slightly in my hand and straightened myself in the saddle. Giving him as much of a smile as I could manage right then, I said, "Well, look after yourself, and when all this is over, we might actually be able to have a conversation." His grin made the blood, the screams, and the sounds of swords on swords, and the bellowing Urgles seem quieter and easier to bear, but not for long. The second we turned away from each other, the protective bubble burst, and we were caught back up in the fighting and separated. The fight carried me over towards Ajihad's battalion, and I caught a glimpse of the fearless leader dueling 3 Kull at once. I also caught sight of Iragan mounted on a very frightening, very angry-looking Saphira. However, I had little attention to spare for any of this. At one point, I found myself beside Murta mounted on a blood-flecked, wide-eyed Tornak. Murtagh sent me a bloody grin, and I returned it. He looked relatively unharmed, and beside him was Auric, who fought with mighty blows of his axe that he delivered to the knees and legs of the Urgles. The combination of Auric and Murtagh was quite deadly, and they were making short work of the Urgles who dared challenge them. Arya also passed me in the fighting, dueling 4 Kull at once with graceful spins and slashes. We fought beside one another for a time, though we were forced apart at some point, and I was sent spinning back towards the center of the battlefield. As the battle progressed, my mind began to focus on nothing else but my sword, the opponents I faced, and I hate to say it, but on killing. I was halfway through dealing with an Urgle when Brahm managed to contact me through the haze of battle-fueled energy that surrounded my mind. I say managed because I was so divorced from my mind, so completely focused on living that I had let my contact with the man fade away and out of my thoughts. Zoe, listen to me. I ducked a Kull's swing and managed to evade being squashed by a dead Urgle as he tumbled backwards. What is it, Brahm? I snapped back. You are needed. Hrothgar and his forces require aid. The fight goes badly for them. Right, where are they? I spun my mare to the side, just managing to avoid being cut in half by a brutal-looking cull. They are on the far east side of the battlefield. I did not respond, but rather fought my way in the general direction. I happened to glance upwards and saw Aragon and Sapphira diving down, and guessing that they were heading to Hrothgar, I followed them. I found the dwarf king in a very nasty situation, though he and his soldiers were making the best of it. King Hrothgar was wearing a very impressive suit of golden armor. He stood at the front of a small knot of dwarves wielding the ancient hammer, Varland, and his white beard stood out against the gold of his armor and the reddish light. He was impressive to watch fight, and each swing of his hammer meant the end of an Urgle, but despite his impressive fighting prowess, dwarves were falling to his left and right. Somehow they had been separated from the main body of dwarves, and now had their backs to the outside of the cavern. The Urgles had surrounded them on three sides, and it was all the dwarves could do to protect themselves, let alone their king, not that he seemed to need much protection. I moved over to Aragon and Sapphira. Aragon gave a wide-eyed half-nod that I returned, but there was no time for talking. Sapphira did not acknowledge me. Her blue eyes glowed with furious fire, and she roared her challenge. Hrothgar did not even seem to acknowledge our presence, just kept on fighting. Raising my blade, I joined in, doing my best to help the dwarves get themselves out of the corner they had been locked in. For a brief moment, I also saw Angela, dressed in green and black armor with her two-handed shaft. Behind her was Salembum in cat form, his teeth bared in a feral grin and a small dagger in one paw. Angela gave me a wicked grin and said, "Always nice to see you, Zoe." "Same to you, Angela," I said, as I spun Mellinless to the left to avoid an Urgle's hammer blow. The witch and her companion vanished amid the Urgles, though they did leave quite the path of dead Urgles behind them. It was then that I happened to glance at Aragon and saw him and Sapphira taking off. I sighed enviously. I would love to be able to leave the battle behind for a few moments of peace and quiet in the air. My moment of envious thinking nearly cost me my life. There is no time for such thoughts or any inaction in battle, and I nearly paid for it with my life. An Urgle had used my distraction to his advantage and swung his club at my undefended chest. I realized this just a little too late, and with a cry I tried to raise my sword. I was going to be too late. I knew this, and I was preparing for that massive blow, but it never came. The Urgle began to choke, and then, to my utter shock, he crumpled sideways. Behind him stood King Hrothgar, mighty war hammer still raised, and his eyes burning with hatred for the Urgles. I gasped out, "Thank you, Your Majesty." He gazed at me and said, "You are welcome. I see you are using the armor we provided." "Yes," I said. "It has saved my life more than once. I thank you, Your Majesty." Hrothgar just nodded his head, and nothing more was said between us, and my attention returned once again to the killing that I had to do if I wanted to survive. However, despite all the Urgles that were felled, there was always another Urgle. They were all fresh, and all ready to win glory by killing as many of us they could. The Battle of Farthandua was by far the most sordid battle I had ever fought in or ever imagined fighting in. Men were falling to my left and right along with dwarves. If something didn't change soon, there was no way we could win this fight. Where was that shade? For once in my life, I wanted him to be here and be here soon. This had to end. This had to end soon. Throughout the battle, I was contacted by Brahm, who did his best to send me where he thought I would be most useful. He also warned me if I was going to become trapped by Urgles. In short, he did his best to keep me and everyone else alive. He must have felt rather guilty not to be down here fighting alongside us, and so did his best to make up for it with his running battle commentary. It was rather annoying at points, I will admit, but what can you do? The old man was doing his best. At one point, I found myself close to Aragon and Sapphira. I had just finished a rather vicious fight with a very large, very brutal cull when I happened to glance over at Aragon, who was dueling from Sapphira's back. Not far away from him was Arya. I saw Aragon hold out a hand to her and help her onto Sapphira, but that was not what held my attention for long. To my horror, I saw an Urgle running towards her just as she prepared to take off. I realized three things right then. The first was that Aragon and Arya were going back into Trondheim. If Aragon was going back then, that meant Durza was going to be here very soon. But there was something of more immediate concern. For in that split second, I realized was that I had to stop the Urgle before he lifted his axe and smashed it into Saphira's chest. All thoughts of changing future events went out of my head as my hand closed around the small knife in my belt, the last one I had. Time slowed. I raised my arm, took aim, and let the small blade fly. It flew through the air with deadly accuracy, finding its mark in the back of the Urgle's neck just as he lifted his axe. For a second he was stopped mid-step before falling to the ground. He was stopped, his life ended, but his axe no. No, his axe was still moving, still carrying all the force of the blow he had been about to inflict, and it was sent spinning forward and straight into Saphira's side. I screamed. I could not help it as I watched the blue dragoness struggle upwards. The dent in her armor, while not as severe as it would have been had I not stopped the Urgle, was still hampering her. The dragoness had to struggle to get herself up, and her flight erratic, she turned herself towards Trondheim. I had no time to regain myself after that little incident. I spun my mare and began to fight with all my remaining strength in an effort to get back to the city before it was too late. I managed to burst through a knot of Urgles and had a clear gallop towards the blood-flecked white marble walls of the city mountain. I pressed my heels to my mare's tired sides. In desperation, I leaned down and whispered in her ears in the ancient language, "Run, Melinlas, run!" And run she did. My brave little mare galloped with all she had to the city. No one tried to stop or question us. A few Urgles sent some arrows our way, but they fell short of their mark, and we continued on. While my mare galloped towards the city mountain, I contacted Brahm with my mind. "Brahm, what? Get to the central chamber as quickly as you can. Durza is going to be breaking through there." Brahm did not respond, but rather quickly cut the link with a hurried, "I'll get there right away." I prayed with all my heart that he would. I pulled Melinlas up to a stop in front of the front gates to the city. They were shut, about as shut as it can get. The gates might as well have been solid marble. I searched the surrounding walls for anything that might be a door, but there was nothing, nothing at all. Furious tears began to prick my eyes as I searched the walls. No, not now. Don't tell me I'm going to fail because I couldn't find a single door. Don't tell me I can't get into this stupid city because I can't find a single door. Had my brain not been so scrambled by fighting, adrenaline, desperation, despair, and exhaustion, I might have sat back for a moment and actually thought, but I didn't, I couldn't. I was too strung out, way too strung out. I had been fighting for my life for hours, and rational thought was out of my mental capabilities right then. I dismounted haphazardly from my mare, stumbling on the uneven ground, and left her standing there as I began to run my hands over the walls. What I hoped to accomplish by this I don't know, but I had to do something. As I ran my hands over the walls, my fingers slid over a slight notch in the marble wall, and my breath caught in my throat. Was that it? Oh, please let this be it. Please, please, with all my heart and more. Was that really a small chink in the wall? It was invisible until you got close, and actually saw the irregular break in the smooth wall that signaled that there was a door, but it was there. I threw my weight against the door, but it refused to open. I flung myself against it only for it to remain stubbornly shut. It could only be opened from the inside. I left out a half wail, half anguished sob as I leaned my tired body against the door. Why now? Why, when I had to be somewhere, did this have to happen? I was crying. I was beyond exhausted. I was burning with adrenaline, and I was furious. I hadn't realized that until now. I was angry, and it left me gasping for breath as I tried to contain my outrage. I was mad at the Urgles. I was mad at Galbatorix, but above all, I was furious with whoever had sent me here unprepared, with no guidelines and no hints. I pounded my fists against the door. Why? Why me? Why did they have to do this to me? It wasn't fair. No, it was so stupidly unfair that I wanted to blow something up. Something inside of me stirred, but I ignored it first. All my attention was on my furious, childish outburst of emotion, but the feeling grew until I could no longer ignore it. My anger, my desperation and fear had broken the wall around some hidden part of myself that had been locked away and out of reach until then. With newfound energy pumping through my veins, my fury lent me the key to unlocking this hidden part of who I was. I began to whisper, not in the ancient language or any other language I thought I knew, but another one, and I could not have told you what I was saying or why. It was beautiful, lyrical, and powerful. Something stirred within me, and white-hot fire began to spread through my tired limbs, and I felt strong. My weariness and pain was left behind as this new power flew through me. I focused all my will, all my newfound strength, whatever was awakening inside of me, on one word: open, 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 because of Iragan and Saphira. Open. I knew that all my strength, all my love, all my anger was going into that single word. Whatever it took, I would pay the price. My hands burned and I cried out, but I kept on. All my hope that we still might survive. Open, for good or for ill. Open. And it did. With a mighty crack, the door was blasted back from its hidden hinges. I gasped as the power inside of me suddenly died and left me feeling slightly sick and weak. I shook my head and pushed myself straight, using the wall to support my weight. It hadn't really registered what I had just done. My mind was already onto other things, and I whispered, "Melinlas." My mare moved forward nervously, and I smiled slightly as I dragged myself back onto her back. I was distantly aware of scorch marks on the marble wall around the door frame, as well as cracks that spread out from the hole I had blasted in the wall. "We must hurry," I said, and once again Melinlas needed little encouragement. She leapt forward, and while I hated to gallop her up the hard city streets, I knew I had to. I steered her as best I could and tried to get myself back together. I refused to think about what I had done, but rather what I had to do. I drew my sword as we neared the central chamber, my heart thudding a loud, regular rhythm in my chest. The city was deathly quiet, except for the sound of Melinla's hooves on the hard stone. Even the sounds of battle did not reach these deserted streets. The quiet was a blessed relief, but it also set me on edge. It was too quiet, and it was getting to me. I had just come from the hurly-burly of battle, and silence felt like a dangerous enemy after that barrage of sound. When I was within easy running distance of the room, I stopped my mare and rested a hand on her sweaty neck. "Stay here, Melinlas. Come back for you. Thank you." She gazed at me with liquid brown eyes and gave me a nudge. I smiled and turned swiftly, running along the marble corridor towards the central chamber. I burst into the central chamber to see my worst nightmare being played out in front of me. Durza and Iragan squaring off while Urgles watched in the shadows. The marble floor of the chamber was cracked and broken from where they had broken through. I froze in the shadows of an arch, and my chest constricted painfully. What now? What the hell did I do now? I cast my thoughts around desperately, but could not find Brahm anywhere. My mental line with the old storyteller was broken. What had happened to him? No, 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 what did I do now? I had solved the door problem only to come here and realize that I had no plan. I had some madcap idea of a plan that vanished the second I actually got here. I did not know what to do, and nor did I have time to make a plan. My entrance to the fight had not been noticed by anyone, but I decided to change that. Worst comes worst, then it would be both Iragan and I against Durza. Lovely, just what I wanted to do when I was this disorganized and at such a low point in my strength. Suddenly, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Earmund whispered in my mind, "What about your mind? Or have you forgotten one of your greatest strengths? Why go bursting in with a drawn sword when you can influence the fight from the shadows and not go risking future events?" A smile began to spread slowly across my face. Of course. Of course, how could I have forgotten? Sending my thoughts outward, I slipped into the mind of the shade and began to interfere. Suddenly, he could not quite concentrate as well on his attack on Iragan's mental defenses because of the strange things that were being whispered into his mind. I sung the lyrics to the most annoying song. I told bad jokes and did my best to confuse, distract, and infuriate the spirits that controlled Durza. My brilliant plan worked amazing until Durza happened to glance towards where I was hiding. He must have caught sight of the slight glint of my armor or the vague outline of my body because, in that chilling voice, he called out, "Who goes there? Or do I have sent my Urgles to fetch you?" Iragan did not glance my way, though he must have known it was me hiding there. I sent my thoughts around for Brahm once more, but found nothing, and so, cursing under my breath, I gritted my teeth and I stepped out. I raised my sword to a defensive position and had to smile at the look of complete shock, surprise, and anger that flashed across the shade's perfectly terrifying mask of a face. The emotions, however, quickly faded to be replaced by a feral smile that sent chills down my spine. "So you managed to live, did you?" said Durza silkily. "Well, well, well, this is a fun little gathering, isn't it, Ryder? Your loyal little friend, and soon your dragon will be joining us. The king will be pleased indeed." Iragan sent me one quick, desperate look, and I sent a small tendril of assurance to him through my mind. Of course, he did not believe we would be okay. Then again, deep down, neither did I. One does not escape a shade easily or unscathed, especially when that shade is fueled by fear of what his master would do if he returned empty-handed. "What?" I asked coolly as I stepped forward cautiously. "Makes you think we are going to the king?" "Our little girl," said Durza. "Why must you play this game? None of you can defeat me, so why try? I think you have grown overconfident, Durza." He smirked. "Tell me then, girl. What can you, a weak, battle-weary human girl, or a battle-weary and weak rider, do against me? A shade who poses a challenge to even the greatest of elven warriors." I could not help it. I really could not help it. I laughed. I laughed and shook my head in amusement. Durza was frightening, of course, but he was such a perfect example of a classically bad villain with all the classically evil lines that it was almost comic. Notice I say almost, and that almost only comes when you are running on the last ebbs of your strength and have just faced imminent death and are about to face it again. Your brain really isn't thinking very clearly, and you find things you usually find terrifying somehow funny. "Oh, Durza," I said, "can't you just realize that we aren't about to give up so easily?" He looked, if possible, a little unnerved by my laughter, but not for long. "Then let us get this over with." And with that, he lunged at Iragan, who luckily saw it coming and met the shade's strike with his own. I leapt forward and entered the duel. Durza met each of our strokes, and I wondered how long I could keep this up. Not long at all, I thought, as I narrowly avoided a strike at my left ribs. I was too tired, and so was Iragan. We were just too tired. In a swift movement, Durza sent Zarok flying from Iran's grasp into the floor a few feet away. Without pausing in his stroke, the shade raised the point of his sword to Iragan's neck. I froze as Durza met my gaze with his own that glittered with victory and cruel amusement. He ran the point along Iragan's neck, drawing a thin line of blood, and I gave a small pained gasp. My body was frozen, my mind unable to work as everything suddenly went still around me. "You see, little girl," said Durza softly. "Do you not see now? We will always win. No matter what you do, we will always win. No one is ever going to be strong enough to defeat us." I knew that by us, he meant the evil, twisted spirits inside of him. I almost thought about dueling him mentally, but I could not. For the moment I did, he would kill Iragan. We were officially dead, but not quite, I suddenly realized. Where was Saphira and Arya? Where the hell were they? Hope surged through my veins. I glanced at Iragan and saw him looking at me steadily. He raised his eyes to the ceiling, and I understood in a flicker of a moment as we shared our silent code. They are coming, just above, soon. My heart was beating unsteadily, my hands sweaty around the wire-wrapped hilt of my sword. Meeting the shade's gaze, Iragan said steadily, "You keep forgetting about something, Durza." "Oh," said the shade. "And what would that be, Ryder?" His voice changing to an amused hiss. "Dragons." And with that, he flung himself backward from Durza and towards his sword. The ceiling, the most prized jewel of the dwarves, at that precise moment, began to crack, and in a sudden bang, the entire, beautifully carved gem of the star rose shattered in thousands of pieces that tumbled down towards us. Durza glanced upwards in shock, and I saw Iragan raise his sword. The red blade was glowing red hot with flames, but Durza let out a furious snarl, and before I could do anything, he slashed his sword at Iragan. The rider cried out in agony, and I saw blood, and then everything suddenly slowed down. It felt like the world had just been paused at that exact instant. I felt as if I was trying to run underwater. I saw Iragan, his face white with pain, glaring up at Durza, who had raised one hand towards Saphira and Arya. I saw Saphira, flames flaring from her gaping maw, and Arya was wielding her blade in one hand, diving down toward us. I saw the falling shards of the star rose. I saw Durza open his mouth to say something, a spell or curse. I saw Iragan raise his sword, the red blade still glowing with blue flames, and stab it through the heart of the shade. Then, as if life had suddenly been injected into my veins, something inside of me suddenly woke up, and I leapt forward, sending out a mental shield that surrounded Iragan's mind as the shade wavered, and then crumbled, the spirits flying upwards as the shade's body disintegrated, leaving nothing but a sword and a pile of armor. The walls I erected around Iragan were tested as the shade's evil power battered against them in an effort to get at the quickly fading rider, but they held like stone against a wave as I filled them with my power and strength of my will. I did not notice Saphira landing or the gentle settling of the shattered jewel. My attention was on the rider in front of me. I fell to my knees, and my sword clattered down beside me, dropped by my suddenly nerveless hand. I quickly turned Iragan over only to see a mess of blood, ripped armor and more blood. I let him back down and could not help the sob that escaped me. One glance around me told me that I was alone. I saw Arya unconscious on Saphira's back and utterly useless to me then. The dragoness herself was shaking with the effort of what she had done and the pain that must be radiating from Iragan through to her. I glanced down at Iragan. "Iragan," I whispered. "You've got to stay awake, please." I cradled his head in my lap and looked down. I had, in my life as Zoe of Prydain, seen enough injuries to know that few people could lose blood like this and live. I smoothed back his bloody hair and tried to press some of my strength into his rapidly fading body. I felt as if I was choking. He was still alive, but terror was coursing through my veins. To have him die in front of me with Saphira right there was utterly terrifying. His eyelids fluttered. "Saphira," he whispered. His voice was shaking with pain, and I gently stroked his face as I tried to keep him from letting himself go and vanish into the endless darkness of death. I was no healer, and I had nothing with which to bind the wound. I was useless, worse than useless. After all the things I had done and learned, I still could not save someone when it mattered. I hated the feeling. I hated this helplessness with all my heart. "She's here," I said, trying to keep the fear from my voice. "Come on, Iragan. Stay with me, Iragan." I cried out desperately as he groaned in pain and squeezed his eyes shut. He was fading, and with each drop of blood that left him, he grew weaker and weaker. Suddenly I felt the weight of my horn at my hip. It seemed heavier somehow than it had before, as if it was trying to remind of its presence. My hand grabbed it spasmodically, the grasp of a desperate person, and I raised it. The eyes of the lion almost looked alive in the light. They glowed and winked as I gazed at them. I suddenly wondered at my foolish mind for ignoring such an obvious solution. I had my horn, a horn from another world where magic pulsed and wove its way into everything. Without thinking, I raised it to my lips and blew for the first time since I had left my home. The sound that echoed from it was long, and it echoed around the room and spread out farther. It soothed me, but it also made my heart thrum with hope. It reverberated through my very soul as it spread outwards. It caught me up in its wild power, crying out with wild urgency. I did not have to wait long. As I lowered the horn from my mouth and let it fall back to my side, I saw Angela running from a tunnel. She was covered in Urgle blood, and behind her ran Salimbum in boy form. The relief I felt was almost palpable. Angela was here. She would make this right, and I could pass Iragan off to her. I could let a true healer take over. "Angela," I said desperately. The witch knelt beside me, her voice brisk, and the length of her sentences kept to the absolute minimum. "Get Arya. I'll take him. Keep your shield around his mind. It is preventing the shade from destroying his consciousness." I nodded and rocked back on my heels as Angela lifted Iragan and hurried with him towards one of the tunnels. I went to Saphira, who did not even acknowledge me, and removed Arya from the saddle. As the elf's weight settled into my arms, I nearly dropped her as my body screamed out in pain, and I dropped her to hard floor. I gasped in agony and looked down to see blood coming from a wound to my shoulder. I must have gotten it during the battle, and in my adrenaline-fueled state, I had not noticed it. Shaking my head to try and clear the pain from it, I half lifted the elf, but didn't get very far because Brahm was suddenly beside me. How did I not notice him? Was I that dead to my surroundings? Guess so. "Zoe," he said, his voice a confused mix of weariness and worry. "Brahm," I whispered. "I'll take Arya. Where is Iragan?" "With Angela. She went that way." I gestured vaguely at the tunnel the witch had run through, and Brahm nodded before taking the elf from my arms. "You need a healer, Zoe," said the man, looking at me with a mix of worry, kindness, and fear. "I'll be fine. It's Iragan you should be worried about." My shield around his mind was still there, and I could still feel the dark remains of the shade pounding against it, as well as the quickly fading consciousness of Eragon. "Go, Brahm," I said, pushing myself straight. He gave me another worried, reluctant look, and I tried to smile. "I'll be fine. Go," he sighed, but with another reluctant look at me, he hurried away with the limp body of Arya in his arms. "Saphira?" I asked the dragon, stoking the bit of exposed scale on her lower jaw. "Saphira, it will be all right." My reassurances sounded false in the heavy air of the chamber. How could anything be all right then with so many dead? Nothing was all right. We both knew that. "Zoe, what will happen to Eragon? I cannot reach him. I can barely feel him." "I don't know," I said truthfully, and I did not know, and neither did I really want to think too hard about it. "You should go to him, Saphira. I promise you that Angela will do all she can for him. Have hope." The dragon nodded her head slightly and began to pick her way through the shards of the jewel as she made her way after Angela and Brahm. The normally strong, proud dragon was a shattered remnant of who she had been only a moment before as she flew down with fire erupting from her mouth. She did not even bother to lift her tail up to avoid hitting the jagged remains of the jewel or mention her use of fire. Left alone, I retrieved my sword from where I had dropped it and returned to my mare that was still standing where I had left her. Melinla's had one hind leg cocked and both ears perked. I could not help but smile as I stroked her neck and whispered another "thank you" in her ears. For a second I just stood there, leaning my body against the warm shoulder of Melinla's and breathing in the smell of warm horse before I led her back through the empty tunnels towards the stables on the lower levels. The distant sounds of fighting could still be heard from the battlefield as I drew closer to the lower levels, but things would now have turned in the Varden's favor, and I did not think I was in any shape to return to the fighting. My horse was certainly not. I arrived to find only one stable hand in the stables. He was a young man who hurried forward from his seat on a hay bale when he saw me and my mare enter the building. Most of the horses were gone, except for a few who stuck their heads out of their stalls and whinnied joyfully when they saw my mare, who was too tired to even whicker. The young man took the reins from my hand and said, "What is going on out there, my lady?" He was maybe 17, and I wondered why he had been left behind. Perhaps he could not fight, though that would be strange for a young man in the Varden, or, well, who knows. I didn't really care at this point. I shrugged. Durza has been killed, and the battle has been tipped in the Varden's favor. The tension in the boy's shoulders fell away, and he smiled. No better news could there be. Who killed Durza? And what was that noise that came from the city, or the explosion by the main gates? I thought the Urgles had broken the gates down. I smiled tiredly. Rider Eragon killed Durza. The noise was the sound of my horn when I summoned help. As for the bang, well, that was me too. I had to get into the city, and the only way was to blast a hole in the wall. I was so exhausted that I did not even see the funny side of what I had just said. It was all I could to do to stay awake, let alone censure my words for the sake of a stable hand. The boy's eyes widened, and he stared at me wide-eyed before saying, "Oh, well, let me look after your mare, my lady. She is in need of tending, and so are you." I saw the faint flush of color in his cheeks as he said that to me, and I could not have agreed more. I did need tending, but I also wanted to stay with my mare, who had been such a faithful companion through this entire mess. Trying for some lightness in my voice, I said, "I'm fine. Let me help you." The stable hands was too intimated by me to argue, so he let me hold my mare while he removed her tack, sponged the blood and sweat from Melinla's coat, and then stitched some wounds on her flanks before he bandaged them, and then placed a warm blanket over her. Leaving me with my horse, he prepared a stall, and at last I was allowed to let Melinla's go into the roomy, deeply bedded stall. The mare drank, ate a little hay, and then lay down with a deep, happy groan of contentment. The stable hand left me, and I suddenly just wanted to lie down and fall asleep with my horse. The deep straw bed was looking about as comfortable as it could get, so ignoring my various injuries and the press of my other duties, I slipped inside the stall and curled up in the crook of my mare's neck. Melinla's gave a soft nicker, and that was the last thing I heard before falling asleep. Some sensible part of me made me check on my barricade around Eragon's shattered, pain-filled mind. It was still strong, and so I added more layers of protection to it before giving in to sleep completely. I left a small thread of connection between it and my own mind so I would know if it changed. I did not dream, I just fell into a dark pool of nothing. It was a blessed release from everything that happened to me that day. It was over, and we were still alive. Somehow, miraculously, we were still alive. So far, and that had better not change. Murtagh groaned as he made his way to the stable with Tornak. The horse stumbled wearily beside him, and every step Murtagh took sent stabs of pain through his leg from a gash delivered by a cull that had aimed to cut him from the saddle. He had tied a rough bandage around it, but it would need cleaning and stitching soon. Also on his list of pressing concerns was Zoe. He had not seen her since the battle, and no one he had asked had known either where she was or what had happened to her. He knew that it had been her horn that echoed out across the battlefield from the city mountain, but that was not helping him find her. In fact, it just made him more worried. What had happened to force Zoe to blow her horn? She had never used it in the time he had known her, and would only have blown it if she was forced to. The stable was bustling with soldiers attending to their horses, but one young man, a stable hand who had not fought by the looks of him, appeared beside Murtagh so silently that the young warrior jumped and fell back into a defensive position. He must be exhausted indeed to allow someone to slip up on him like that. Perhaps it was best he had left the battlefield when he had. "May I take your horse?" asked the young man, holding out a hand for Tornak's reins. Shaking his head slightly to clear his thoughts, Murtagh nodded his head and let the boy take the reins from him. "Yes," said Murtagh, "take good care of him for me." "Also," Murtagh paused and asked, "you haven't seen a young woman come in with a dark grey mare, have you?" His voice was desperate despite his best attempts to control it. To his utmost relief, the young man nodded. "She came in first. Her mare is in the 7th stall on the right, and you will find the lady there too. She is asleep with her horse, and I did not want to wake her." Murtagh gave him a true, grateful smile before hurrying towards the indicated stall. Zoe was there. She was curled up with her head on her mare's neck and one hand under her cheek. The mare flicked one ear at Murtagh, but did nothing when he entered the stall and allowed him to kneel, painfully, beside the sleeping form of Zoe. A quick inspection of her confirmed that she had not escaped the battle unscathed. Gently shaking her shoulder, he smiled as she flinched, and one hand went to her sword. "It's me," said Murtagh softly, as Zoe opened her dark grey eyes. "Murtagh?" she asked groggily, as she struggled to sit up only to wince and close her eyes in pain. "What's happening?" "Not much," said Murtagh. "I just came in from the battlefield. Ajahad is planning to send groups of men in to chase Urgles that escaped into the tunnels. I will be going with them once my injuries have been seen to. I think you also have some hurts that need tending." She nodded and gratefully accepted his help to stand. She wavered a little on her feet, but managed to get her balance, and Murtagh had to force his worry away. Zoe would appreciate him fussing over her. Now that he could see her better, he saw dried blood on her left shoulder as well as deep grays that went from her temple down her cheek. He had never seen her look so worn. Her face was ashen, and her eyes dull with a mixture of exhaustion and pain. Concern for her filled him again, but aware that he looked no better than she, Murtagh simply offered her his arm, and the two left the stall. They made their way out of the busy stable and back into the street where more and more soldiers, some on stretchers, were arriving. Once they were outside, Zoe said quietly, "I should go and see Aragon. He was badly injured by Durza when he killed him." "You need to have your wounds looked after first," said Murtagh. How could she ignore injuries when they were so obviously affecting her? Not that he could talk about ignoring injuries, nagged a small part of his brain, which was only backed up by a painful twinge of his leg. "Brahm is there, and he can look after me," said Zoe. "Why don't you come with me?" He raised his eyes to the dark cavern of the hollow mountain. How he wished for open sky. The city mountain felt claustrophobic to him right then, and the smell of death was heavy on the air, and it made it difficult to breathe. He longed for a true wind to blow the smoke and death away, or even just cool his sweaty face. It must be dark outside, for no light entered the mountain, and the city was lit with thousands of torches as soldiers hurried this way and that. With a sigh, Murtagh lowered his eyes to gaze deeply into Zoe's tired, pained eyes. "I'll go with you." She smiled, and the two of them made their way from the bottom levels upwards. Zoe seemed to know where she was going, and finally they arrived in a wide, open corridor that Murtagh recognized as the one where the healing hole he had taken Zoe was. Saphira was stretched out in front of a door. She turned her armored head to look at them when they approached. "Murtagh, Zoe," said the dragon. Murtagh thought he had never heard the dragoness sound so miserable. How badly injured was his brother to make Saphira this worried? "Saphira, have you heard anything? Number nor can I do anything for him." The door beside Saphira opened, and Brahm stepped out into the corridor, followed by a haggard-looking Arya. Murtagh stared in open-mouthed amazement. He had never seen the elf princess look that exhausted or disheveled. Her black hair was messed with blood and tangles, her clothes were ripped, and her armor dented from the battle. She looked worse than she had when they had rescued her from Gilead. "Arya," said Zoe, "I did not think you would be awake yet." "Angela has helped me," said Arya simply. She glanced at Brahm. "I must sleep. I will see you all later." With that she left, and Brahm looked after her worriedly. "Will she be all right?" asked Murtagh. "Yes," said Brahm, "but she overused her magic, and it will take her time to recover. We almost lost her." "What about Eragon?" asked Zoe tensely, her eyes never leaving Brahm's face as she gazed at him. An expression of guilt, pain, and worry crossed Brahm's already lined face. "Angela is doing all she can. Your mental shield is preventing his mind from being tormented by the remains of the spirits, but the wound Durza gave him is grievous indeed." Murtagh shifted his weight painfully, and the wince, along with the movement, caught Brahm's eye. "Come," said the storyteller firmly. "I will treat your injuries. I know that Ajahad will want both of you to help him remove the Urgles, and so you will need to get back to him quickly." Revised 1/27/2014. Enjoy. 27. Chapter 28. I am so sorry about how long this took. School has been demanding way too much attention. This may seem a bit fillerish, but it will be followed quickly by some more chapters. I did promise to have this done before the new year after all. As always, thank you. Note I've changed how Zoe narrates what is going on around her. I wanted her to almost feel like she's speaking directly to the reader, you, instead of just recording events. Let me know if you like this or not. It had been a long 3 days. After Brahm had tended to our various bangs and scraps, Murtagh and I had joined the patrols that Ajahad was leading after the retreating Urgles. It was not pleasant, not in the least, and I will spare you my complaining about the lack of sleep, the fighting, and the irritable dwarven guides who glared at us under their heavy brows as they muttered curses under their breath. It was highly irritating, and it was made worse by my own foul mood, which hung around me like a thick, black thunderhead, and made everything seem twice as bad as it actually was. I took a certain amount of vindictive pleasure watching everyone skirt around me, as if I was a dragon who might snap their heads off any minute. My thinking went along the lines of, why waste energy in the personal charm category when you could be putting it towards getting out of the damp, dark, and suffocating tunnels in one piece? Ah, I am sorry, I am beginning to rant again. My apologies. I truly did not mean to vent to you at all, but well, sometimes it slips when you are as tired as I am. I had managed to escape the patrols when Murtagh was bashed over the head by an Urgle, and another managed to crack a bone in my arm. Perhaps managed is the wrong choice of words, for I was glad to help the Varden, but it was with a huge sigh of relief that I returned to the open air of the city mountain. I was not claustrophobic, but I had felt trapped in those dark tunnels that smelled of damp moss and blood. At least Farthen Dua was open, and you could catch sight of stars, and the sun if you strained your eyes, and the air inside of the mountain was not too smoky. Though I reflected, the smell of death is heavy here too. It lingered on the air and conjured memories of those brutal hours spent on the battlefield. I could not escape the smell, and could not I escape the memories of the battle that flashed across my vision when I tried to catch a few minutes' rest. Where was I now? You, the patient reader, asks. Right this second I was resting my head against the white wall of the hallway in the healing wing of Trondheim, where Eragon was still asleep. My right arm was bandaged tightly, and I had managed to have a bath and change my clothes. I had sent my armor to be cleaned and repaired, and thrown my bloodied, ripped, and in general ruined clothing out. After that was taken care of, I had made sure my various weapons, including 3 new throwing daggers I had picked up from the dwarves before leaving on patrol, were firmly strapped on. So here I was, sitting cross-legged on the stone floor. I could not help but play with a curl of my dark hair as I sat there. That old habit picked up from the study halls of high school was still there. How ironic. Murtagh was sitting beside me along with Arya, who still had dark shadows under her eyes, and an exhausted Brahm was currently trying to catch some sleep in one of the empty healing rooms. Saphira was stretched her full length down the corridor. Someone had, at one point, removed her armor, but the dragoness had yet to leave her place by the door that marked the entrance into Eragon's chamber. She rarely spoke, and even her scales seemed to have lost their normal bright luster that made her shimmer like 1,000 jewels. The shield I had placed around my friend's mind was no longer in place. Angela had taken that duty over when I left for the patrols. The healer had hoped that the shield had prevented the remnants of the shade from causing any more damage, but that remained to be seen. The young rider was still asleep, or at least that was what Angela had said 3 hours ago when Murtagh and I had arrived in the hallway. The wound Durza had given him was as bad as it had first appeared to me in the central chamber, and Eragon had been lost in a fever made worse by blood loss for the last few days. Healing his body had taken all of Angela's and Brahm's combined strength, along with the secret help of Oramis, far away in Du Weldenvarden. I smiled slightly as I remembered the ancient rider and dragon. Maybe I would get to meet him and mighty Gleeder one day. However, thinking of him reminded me of the dilemmas I was now facing. At least on patrol, my mind had been too occupied on the present to worry about the future, but that was not true anymore. Now I had nothing on which to direct my full attention except for the white wall in front of me, which became the place where the images conjured by my mind played out. On its white, unmarked surface I saw bloody battles, my friends dying while I watched helplessly, Galbatorix taking over not just this world, but Earth and my own home. I could not shake the images, and they were mixed with the things I seen in my most recent battle, along with the ones I had fought beside my brothers and sister. To save Ajahad meant that Naswada would not take control of the Varden. To save Murtagh from his fate was to prevent the second dragon egg from hatching. Even the smallest change sent out ripples that touched multiple other little events until you had an avalanche of change. Yet I was growing tired of this self-doubt and constant worry. I wanted to throw my hands up and just forget about this particular headache. However, no matter how hard I tried, I could not stop thinking about it. Did I change history, or did I leave it? I had risked future events with Brahm and with Arya. Could I bear to betray my friendship with both the Varden's leader and Murtagh just for history? Murtagh would hate me, not that I could blame him at all for that. I would probably feel exactly the same if I was in his shoes and had known that someone could have prevented my suffering. Brahm would hate me for not trying to save Ajahad. Arya would be of a similar mindset, and so would Eragon, though that would be because of Murtagh. Hate may be a strong word, but it seemed appropriate in this situation. For to do nothing was to risk my friendship with those who had come to trust me, but to act meant perhaps losing this war. The white corridor and silence suddenly felt suffocating, and this feeling grew until I could no longer bear to sit here. I pushed myself up from my place on the floor beside Murtagh. Everyone glanced at me in confusion and surprise, but I just said, "I'll be back." Murtagh sent me a worried, concerned look, but said nothing as he returned his gaze to the white wall. Arya just leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes tiredly. Turning, I walked quickly away from my friends, my nervous energy making me walk far faster than normal or even what was considered polite. My shoulders were tight with tension, and I barely glanced left or right as I nearly ran down the corridor. I had one purpose, and that was to try and outrun my own thoughts. My feet carried me through the white marble hallways and past the open doors to the healing halls where men still lay recovering from the battle. I walked even faster by those doors, trying to avoid hearing the moans and small cries of pain that emanated from them. I passed both members of the Varden and dwarves as I wandered through the corridors. All of them greeted with me with a murmured "my lady," or a small bow, and I inclined my head automatically to recognize their words and actions, but did not try to engage any of them in conversation. Call it rude, but I did not feel like speaking or slowing my rapid pace. I finally found myself in a quiet, unused corridor where dust motes glittered in the light, and the silence was heavy, but not in a bad way. This silence was soothing, not smothering. The dusty, unused feeling was comforting to my frenzied thoughts instead of making me feel trapped. As I wandered down the corridor, looking out the open arches to my right, a small measure of peace slowly filled me. This particular corridor overlooked a hidden garden, and flowering vines grew up the arches from below, filling the corridor with their heavy perfume. It was built in a square shape around the beautifully tended garden, a courtyard far removed from everything in this towering city of white marble. No hint of death touched me here. I could forget the memories, the sounds, and the smells that haunted me. I never wanted to leave. Finally, I took a seat on one of the arches and looked out at the garden below me as I rested my head back on the cool stone. Slowly, my body relaxed, and my mind began to slip away, wandering the corridors of my own convoluted memories and feelings. I was startled from my trance-like state by a voice that came from my left, and turning quickly, I saw a woman standing a few feet away. She was very beautiful and dressed in a flowing, cream-colored dress. A circlet of hammered gold rested on her shining black hair. Her smile was kind as she regarded me with her crystal blue eyes. It was then that I realized that she was floating a few inches above the ground, for some reason that seemed perfectly natural, as did the way the light seemed to shine through her as if she was not really there. Everything was so peaceful, and the way she looked at me made me feel both safe and loved. "Zoe," said the woman, walking forward on the air to come and stand in front of me. "You are troubled." For some reason, I felt no reason to answer with a sarcastic or biting comment like I might have done if Brahm or anyone else had spoken that to me in the last few hours. I felt no need to question either her strange appearance or how she seemed to know my name. Instead, I said softly, "Yes." I felt different with this woman, more mature. The only way I can describe it is I felt more like the leader and less like a confused, frustrated and frightened teenager that I had been fluctuating between on most of this journey. You wonder what you should do in regards to your friend Murtagh and the leader of the Varden Ajahad. The simple way she summarized my thoughts made me feel slightly foolish, as if I had been running circles around an easily solved problem. I raised an eyebrow but just said, "Yes." Things were simpler here, and I felt no need to defend, to argue, or to vent. I could just examine the puzzle in front of me without all that emotion clouding my thoughts. The woman sighed softly. "I can only suggest that you follow your heart." "My heart?" I asked. "But what if by following my heart I destroy this world? Do you think that by saving Murtagh you will do this world some good?" "I do not know." I met her wise, kind gaze reluctantly with my own. She smiled and reached out one hand to raise my chin so that she was gazing down at me. "Yes, you do," she said kindly. "You do not think you can trust your feelings, Zoe, but you can. You must live in the present, not in the future. You might fail to save those you wanted to, but you can still try. What will happen if I do save them?" "I cannot say." Her hand was warm on my face, soothing almost like a mother's touch. "Future is not set in stone, and there are many strands. You must think of it as a tapestry. If by adding new colors, new threads, will you change the original plan so much that it bears no resemblance to what you imagined it looking like?" I shook my head slightly in confusion. The woman continued, "You are like a weaver, Zoe, weaving a tapestry for this land. You may be altering the design, but perhaps in a good way. You cannot know for sure until it is all over. In this tapestry," I asked quietly, "does everything work out? I've seen 12 different futures for this land, and all those other worlds that it are connected to Alagaesia through the gates. In each of them but one," and here she paused and looked down on me, her eyes serious, "Alagaesia fell, and by extension each of the worlds that Gabatorix conquered." "What?" I breathed out in horror. Was this my fault? Was everything that desperate? My thoughts were flying from one disaster to another as I imagined what might be waiting for me in what sounded like a miserable future. I hung on to the slim hope that, at least in one plan, everything worked out. Now if I just knew that plan. "Yes," said the woman softly, and her eyes were filled with dark pain. "In all but one weaving. I shall tell you this, however, Zoe, in the future where it ended the right way, it was because you followed your heart and made choices that were both true and honest." She stopped and looked past me. Shaking her head sadly, she said, "I cannot stay much longer. I am needed elsewhere, but I do have a warning and some advice for you, Zoe." I looked up at her, not sure I wanted to hear that warning or that advice. She smiled reassuringly, though her face remained serious. The warning is this: Galbatorix does not know you still live, and the longer you can remain invisible to him, the better. He cannot find out your true heritage or the full extent of your powers. If he does, the information you carry will be put at risk. Nodding in understanding, I looked up into her ancient blue eyes. I will do my best, I said simply. That is all that we ask, said the woman with a faint smile. Continuing to speak, she said, the advice I have for concerns the attachment you feel for the young man, Murtagh. What about Murtagh? I asked, confused and wary at the same time. My feelings for Murtagh were something I did not want to discuss. Not because I was embarrassed by it. Well, okay, maybe I was. But because I did not know what to think of those ridiculous, blush-inducing emotions that made my stomach flutter and my head feel like it was full of fluff, like I was some sort of teenaged schoolgirl. The girls that I had always rolled my eyes at when I went to school on Earth. I had always found those girls to be ridiculous, and now look at me. I was in the middle of a war, not a romance novel. The woman pressed one finger to my lips to stop my frantic explanations and said, you will have to leave this place one day. Alagaesia is not your true home, and Murtagh is destined for another. I felt hollow, like someone had just punched me in the gut, and when I spoke, my voice was shaky. Naswada, I breathed out. Tears began to prick my eyes as I realized that my first impressions about this romance were right. My heart would only end up shattered, and so would Murtagh's. I could not choose between my home and family and the life I had created here in Alagaesia with true friends and allies. This was too hard. A tear rolled down my cheek and fell to the stone floor that I was now staring at. More threatened to join it. I did not know what to think. Should I be grateful that this romance was going to go no farther, or was I actually happy? Was I excited about the possibility of having a relationship with Murtagh that was more than friendship? Was this what heartsickness felt like? Worse, what in the world was I going to tell Murtagh? I must bore you with my questions, but I find myself asking them constantly to try to keep things in some sort of perspective. If you are rolling your eyes at me, then go ahead, but seriously, I was about as confused, emotionally wrung out as I had ever been. What was the point of love if this was all it brought you? SHH, whispered the woman, softly running on finger along the bottom of my eye, catching the tears before more could fall. Love is the greatest gift of all, so treasure it. Love Murtagh if your heart tells you to. He already loves you and you will need him before the end of this. How can I keep doing this? I asked brokenly. My heart already felt like it was snapping in two. You are telling me to be careful because I will have to leave, and then telling me to love him. I was not angry or wanting to lash out. No, I just wanted this to end. To get a clear, easy to understand answer for once. You must live in the now, said the woman, leaning her beautiful head down to kiss me gently on the brow. The kiss sent gentle waves of warmth through my body. I gave you this advice not to break your heart, but to prepare you. It does not mean you cannot love, you cannot sacrifice for Murtagh, but it does mean that you should treasure the time you have now with him. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The woman dropped her hand to my should and said quietly, you should return to your friends. I think that Rider Aragon will be awakening soon, and he will want to see you. Am I strong enough for this? I asked. I was unable to stop the question as I felt myself return to more stable emotional ground away from the tempest that had swept me up in its center. Yes, said the woman simply. You forget, Zoe, that the blood of ancient kings and powerful enchantresses flows through your veins. You have many deeds towards your name. Trust yourself for once. She smiled and lifted my chin with one finger. Trust your heart, little princess. It has yet to lead you astray, except for when you question it. As I looked into her eyes, she pulled me gently into her mind. It reminded me slightly of aria, full lyrical music, and massive like a towering mental mountain above my own small consciousness. But I was quickly distracted by what she showed me. I was looking at myself. I was standing with an old man whose white beard touched the ground in front of a small, white-walled cottage with flowering veins growing up the walls. A small barn lay behind it, and there was a carefully attended vegetable garden and orchard. It was a peaceful, simple place. A heavy tome was under one of his arms, and his bright blue eyes were gazing sternly at my other body. His name flickered on the edges of my memory, just out of reach but so close. Was it M something or D? In a stern voice, the man said, "Maybe if you stopped trying so hard to get somewhere and let things happen as they may, you would not have to struggle against the weight of the world, Lady Zoe." I felt myself slowly withdraw from the woman's mind and return back to the present. I swayed slightly on my feet as I felt myself sink back inside my own body. Wide-eyed, I whispered, "Who are you?" The woman smiled mysteriously as she turned away and began to walk away from me. "You will find out soon enough, Zoe of Angard and Le. You have nothing to be ashamed of either in your own world or this one. Stop worrying about failure and start having a little faith in yourself and your considerable skills." Suddenly, she turned back, and I saw amusement flickering in her eyes, making them dance in the sunlight. "I nearly forgot," she exclaimed with a laugh. From one hidden pocket, she drew a small, black object and threw it to me. I caught it reflexively and looked down to see a black rock, about the size of a golf ball with flecks of white crystal in my palm. I looked questioningly at the woman who just smiled mysteriously. "It was yours before you went to Earth. I believed it was something of a light in dark places." Her smile was secretive, and before I could say anything she vanished in a shimmer of golden light, and the hallway seemed darker without her glowing presence. I sighed, slipping the rock into my pocket, rising as I did so and began to retrace my footsteps to Iragan's room. Despite the gravity of the woman's words and the strangeness of our conversation, my thoughts were calmer, my temper more evened, and I felt that feeling of certainty, of assurance, that I had lacked since the battle, and even before that. I felt collected, calm, and most of all able to deal with any problem with efficient ease. I no longer felt like I was drowning in my inadequacy. As I made my way back to the hallway, I puzzled over the woman's warning. Was it a way of saying I should go to do Weldenvarden? If I remained with the Varden, I would most certainly be reported by some spy to Galbatorix, but to go to the elves would mean peace and a chance to escape the politics of the Varden, which I found so grating. Then there was her advice concerning my love life. How embarrassing to say that to you. I smiled wryly. A few months ago I had been worrying about grades, my divorcing parents, and what my future might look like, but now those worries did not exist for me anymore. I had wanted to be part of a storybook land, and look at me now. Be careful what you wish for, reader. Be very careful. Your world is not as certain as you thought, and all it takes is one ordinary afternoon to shatter your carefully constructed illusion. 28. Recovery. He was too weak. S.O. He had managed to draw his shattered consciousness into a small, bright shell around his core, but he could no more than that. Outside his mind, he was aware of a pain so great that it threatened to break him until he was snuffed out like a candle in the wind, but something or someone kept that pain at bay. He was also aware of another consciousness, this one dark and evil, but it was also kept at bay, and so he did not concern himself with it. In the darkness, he floated between life and death, between hope and despair, between nothing and knowing. He found himself reliving moments of what had to be his life, but there was no way he could be certain. The memories that flitted in front of him were like brightly colored jewels against the deep blackness that surrounded his mind, his very soul, but there seemed to be no connection between them. They came randomly and with no apparent order, but they touched something inside of him, seemed to be fighting to wake him from this dark trance. He saw a dragon egg glowing like a bright blue star in the middle of the dark clearing in the spine. He was crouched in a defensive position, a sword in one hand, staring at the unconscious body of a young woman in the middle of a moonlit clearing. He could not remember her name, but he knew she was important. Just as the dragon egg was something crucial to his destroyed identity. He was standing beside a blue dragon, a red sword was in his hand, and he was staring into the deep shadows beneath the trees that surrounded him. He was about to be attacked. He knew that, but before he could raise the sword, the image changed. He was sitting in front of a small fire. The girl was with him, and a new person, a young man with dark eyes and hair who was caught in mid-laugh. A grizzled old man was seated with them, smoking a pipe. Curled up around them was a bright azure blue dragon. A sense of happiness, of contentment, filled him, but his mind did not let him linger by the small campfire in the middle of an open prairie of grass for long. It blew away like smoke in the wind. The next memory was dark, and it chilled him to the core. It was a small prison cell. The walls were slimy, and the air was moist and heavy with desperation. He wanted, more than anything, to escape this place. This was a bad place, a bad memory, and he wished he knew how he had come to be here. It was with a great sense of relief that that memory vanished to be replaced by a new one. He was riding a sweaty red bay horse under a brilliant night sky. The young man from before was riding beside him on a grey war horse, and far above he saw the dragon flying. Why was he here? Who was the man beside him? Why did they ride so fast and so urgently? Memory after memory claimed him in a never-ending tide of images, sensations, and thoughts, but despite all this, he could not remember. He did not know his name or what the people he saw meant to him. Whoever he was lost in a sea of nothing. He could not escape this emptiness or the memories, for he was too weak, and he did not even know how. Who was he? Who? He did not even know how long he had been here in this darkness. Time had no meaning here, life had no meaning. Perhaps he should just give up. He could feel himself slipping a little towards a kind of blackness that he knew he could never escape. It would be easy to let go, easier than this. He slipped a little further towards that final darkness. It was calling for him. The music coming from it was sweet and comforting. So easy, Eragon. The word echoed through the darkness, but it was distant. Too distant for him to truly hear it. He was getting closer to death. It was strange, but he was no longer afraid of dying. He did not want to fight it any longer. All he wanted was to be free and at peace. Death was offering that to him, and he could no longer deny he didn't want that peace. He had nothing to fight for here, for he did not even know who or what he was. Eragon. The word came again, and this time it was a little clearer. He wondered what the word meant. He knew it meant something, maybe something important to him. His curiosity did not last long, and he felt himself slip a little more, not that he really cared. Eragon, come to me. There was a note of command, of power in that voice. The words it spoke pierced the darkness around him. A little bit of hope grew within him, but as much as he wanted to, he was too weak to do as it asked. He did not know how to follow that voice, and nor did he wish to abandon the little bit of security he had for the deep, black unknown that the voice was calling him into. You must come with me, Eragon. Come back to the light. Come back. This time he felt as if a hand was reaching out to him, an offer he could refuse. He did not really think about it, just reached out and took that hand. Slowly he felt himself being pulled out of the darkness and farther away from death. It was hard. As the darkness began to clear, he felt pain. It was still distant, but it was there and demanding his attention. Why had he taken that hand? He did want to live. He wanted peace and rest. Death had promised him that and more. He wanted the end. As the darkness began to clear, he found himself remembering more and more. His life was beginning to fit together like puzzle pieces. His name was Eragon. He was a rider for the dragon Saphira. His half-brother was Murtagh, and his best friend was Zoe. He had killed the shade Durza. As he remembered Durza, he felt the splitting pain of the sword biting into his flesh. He remembered Zoe speaking to him through the burning pain, and he remembered fighting in the battle. Had the Varden won? He did not know, and nor did have the strength to worry. The Varden meant nothing to him here, nor did Saphira. He felt nothing, and nor did he want to. The voice came again, and this time Eragon felt the touch of another mind, one so vast that it made him feel like an ant next to a mountain. Like Arya's mind, music ran through this one. The notes were majestic, and they spoke of glory, sadness, but courage. He suddenly realized that this was what was blocking the pain, what had lifted him away from death, but it was not blocking that evil, vicious darkness that threatened to overwhelm the rider and sweep him away to death's welcoming arms. Eragon, I have protected you as best I can, but you are too far away for me to much more than shield you from the pain. You must come back to the light. The voice resonating deep within him like a deep drum that called him forward. He knew he should respond, but his thoughts were too slow to formulate a response. When he finally managed to speak, his words were brief and soft. Who are you? I go by many names, but I hold the answers to the question you ask. Once again, summoning all his strength, he asked, Where are you? He wanted answers, and he wanted the weight of responsibility to be lifted from him. Maybe this stranger could do that for him. Maybe. Follow Arya. She will bring you to me. I have waited many long years for you, so do not delay, or it may be too late. Now rest, young rider. You have wrought a deed few others could. Rest easy knowing that. An image was passed from the stranger to Aragon of a brilliant white figure standing on the edge of cliff face. Warmth, kindness, pride, and peace emanated from the foreign mind. It enveloped him, soothing and comforting him as he slid into a true sleep. He did not even have time to reply to the stranger, for before he even really knew it, he was asleep, but this time he was in a place of light and not shadow. His mind at rest as he slumbered untroubled by memories, pain, or the evil darkness of the shade, or the troubles that came as part of a dragon rider. He had been brought back from the doorstep of death. Far away, on a sun-drenched cliff in the middle of the dense forest of Du Weldenvarden, a silver-haired elf turned and gazed at his golden dragon. For a long moment the elf and the dragon merely stared at each other. Their surroundings were peaceful, the sky eggshell blue and a gentle breeze making the leaves rustle softly. "He will live?" asked the dragon at last. "Yes," said the cripple who is whole. "He will live and he will seek us out." The elf turned and gazed out at the sweeping forest that spread out below the cliff. His heart was uneasy, and he did not truly know why he was so unsettled. It was a feeling that he was unused to, and he did not quite know from where it came or for what reason. "That is what you wish to accomplish," said the dragon, "so why are you still troubled?" The dragon never took his liquid gold eyes off the elf, and his tail flicked lazily from side to side, as if he was planning on pouncing. "I am troubled about what the repercussion of killing the shade will be for Aragon. You fear that the shade may have cursed him." "Yes, but there was some other power guarding him. That is what worries me. It was a power that did what I could not, and protected him from the fragments of the shade. You do not know who this power belongs to. No, it was not Arya or Brahm, but someone else, and they were no weak Varden spellcaster. It was someone powerful, and they had created an unusually strong mental shield around Aragon. Few have that skill or the strength to do that. Do you think it has anything to do with the wild magic that was released a few months ago? The magic that rocked the whole of Du Weldenvarden and sent the elves into a panic? Perhaps. Everything is connected, and I would not be surprised if there are greater things at work than first meets the eye. We will have to wait then. The dragon closed its eyes as if in sleep, and the elf turned back to look at it. The dragon was not really asleep, but he was pretending to be. For a long moment the elf could say nothing. The dragon, as usual, thought the elf with a little amusement was right, and he had allowed himself to think too far ahead. "Yes," said the elf. They would wait. They would wait for Aragon and Saphira. They had waited this long, and they could wait a little longer. They would wait for this strange new power to reveal itself, and above all, they would wait until it was time to exact a heavy price from Galbatorix. Yes, they would wait, and in time all would be. Elf looked out in the direction of Farthendua, and he could not help the shiver as he remembered that power. It had been a strange kind of power, one unlike anything he had ever touched before. The world, thought the ancient elf, is changing. Things are remembering and wakening. Things will never be the same. Aragon. The voice commanded him. It came again. Aragon. There was a trace of exasperation in that voice, as if the owner was nearing the end of their patience. Wake. Shifting slightly, he found himself more than a little reluctant to leave the warmth and comfort of the deep sleep he had found himself in. The voice came again from somewhere above him. Rise, Oggetlam. With a reluctant groan, he forced his eyes open and found himself gazing a high, cream-colored ceiling. He was lying in a soft bed, and the warm light of morning fell across the crisp white sheets. Angela, the herbalist, was sitting beside the bed in a chair. The healer was staring at him intently with those mysterious eyes of hers. "How do you feel?" she asked. Disorientated and confused to find himself in this peaceful, light-filled place, he did not quite know what to say in response to that question. He wasn't sure just how he felt. There was pain, a pounding headache, a nauseous feeling from his stomach, and a weakness in his limbs that was strange. All in all, he was unsure of just how to convey all of this in a way that would not make him sound weak and complaining. Someone had removed his armor and dressed him a soft, cream-colored tunic. "No idea," Aragon finally managed to croak out. His mouth was dry and sore, another thing to add to a growing list of things that he was feeling. "Don't, whatever you do, move. You need to save your energy for other things," said Angela. Examining her a little more closely, the young rider saw that she still wore her armor, and that dark shadows ringed her eyes. Her curly red hair was even more crazed and stuck out at odd angles from her head. A fit of coughing suddenly struck him and made him dizzy, light-headed, and a shooting pain from his back briefly blinded him. With a gasp, Eragon clenched his hands beneath the sheets and squeezed his eyes shut as the pain slowly faded. A gentle hand stroked his cheek, and he felt the edge of a glass on his lips. "Drink," commanded Angela. Unquestioning, Eragon obeyed, and a warm, slightly spicy liquid ran down his throat. It warmed him, and the pain slowly receded, leaving him feeling twice as weak but a little better. Opening his eyes, he gazed up at the herbalist. What happened? Vague images of the battle returned to him. The Urgles, Durza, and then Saphira. He would have leapt from the bed right that second if he could have, as he gasped out, "Saphira." He went to push himself upright, but the same pain from before returned, and he was forced to lie still. Angela rested a hand on his shoulder. "They lived," assured Angela gently, "and they have been waiting for you to awaken. Do you wish to see them?" He managed to nod his head briefly. What had happened? The last thing he remembered was Saphira falling, flames, and Zoe's desperate voice. Then that darkness and that presence, whose words had called him back to the land of the living. Angela threw open the door. Arya, Murtagh, Brahm, and then Zoe filed inside. Saphira snaked her giant blue head into the room after them, her body too big to fit through the doorway of the healing room. Her chest vibrated as she hummed deeply, eyes sparkling in a mixture of joy and relief. A smile unconsciously found its way onto Eragon's face as he touched her thoughts. For a moment they merely shared in the combined relief, gratitude, and joy. "It is good to see you awake, little one," she said tenderly. "And you too, but how? The others want to explain it, so I will let them." You breathed fire. "Yes," she said with a toothy grin and not a little pride. He turned his attention to the four people who were all watching him closely. Arya, Zoe, and Murtagh were bandaged. Arya and Zoe on their arms, and Murtagh on his head. They all looked exhausted, with dark shadows under their eyes, and Eragon had never thought Brahm had looked more aged than he did right then. Murtagh grinned and said with a smirk, "About time you were awake. I was getting tired sitting in that corridor." "Murtagh," said Zoe with a smile, "you don't say that to a person when they've just come back from death's doorstep." "What happened?" asked Eragon with a faint smile. "I don't remember much." "You wouldn't," said Brahm. The old rider was gazing at his son with a mix of worry, relief, and irritation that is born of that worry and relief. "You were barely alive for the last few days." "Days?" asked Eragon confusedly. Had it really been days since the battle? "3," said Arya from beside Brahm. "The Varden are calling you a hero." "Without you," said Zoe with a warm smile, "we would not have defeated them." Eragon opened his mouth to ask another question, but Brahm, seeing that Eragon was growing impatient for more information, cut him off. "When you defeated Durza, the Shade spirits were released as well, and this broke the enchantment he had cast of the Urgles to unite them. Without magic, they turned against each other, and clans started to fight clans. After that, it was an easy matter for the Varden to finish them, and the battle ended in our favor." "We routed them," cried Murtagh with a jubilant smile. Both Zoe and Arya looked sad, their eyes remembering the sights of the battle and the many dead men who still lay on the field of battle. But Murtagh was above all of this, and his grin was broad. "They're all dead?" asked Eragon, as he smiled back slightly. "No," said Zoe. "Many of them were able to escape into the tunnels, and the Varden have been searching for them these last few days. Ajihad worries that they may attack the Varden if they are not dealt with. Murtagh and I returned this morning after we received our various injuries. Murtagh got a bang to the head, and I cracked a bone." Looking over at Arya and Saphira, Eragon asked, "How come you and Saphira did not crash? I still don't remember much of that, just you two falling," and he trailed off as he looked at the elf. Arya met his gaze and said slowly, "There was no time from when we landed, and I tried to remove Saphira's armor, and the time when Durza attacked you and Zoe. Durza would have either killed the two of you or taken you active if I had used Val Turin." Arya stopped, and a look of regret and sorrow passed over her face as she continued, "So I broke the star sapphire, and Saphira carried me down." Eragon was forced to close his eyes as another wave of pain mixed with nausea and lightheadedness struck him. When he opened his eyes, he saw expressions of concern on all those present. Trying to ease their worries, he said, "But how come the pieces did not hit either you or me?" Giving him another look of deep concern, Arya said, "I didn't allow them to." I lowered them to the floor just before they struck it. Her words made Aragon stare at the elf in shock. She had done what? That was feat of magic few would ever dare attempt or even think. Angela sent the elf a poisonous glare and said sourly, "Yes, and nearly killed yourself in the process. You're as bad as an elfling who has to stick their nose into everything simply because they can." "Perhaps," said Zoe with a diplomatic smile, "we should leave Aragon to rest. He has just recovered after all." "Good idea," said Angela snappily. The witch rose from her chair and sent Brahm a stern look. "Stay with him. I will return later." "Of course," said Brahm with an incline of his head, and with a toss of those red curls, the petite, red-headed woman left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Zoe, Murtagh and Arya left right after promising to see him later, and Aragon was left with Saphira and his father. Aragon felt tired. It would be easy to slip off to sleep in the comfortable bed. Perhaps he should after all. No one needed him in his current condition. "You do not know how close you came to dying," said Brahm wearily, taking Angela's vacated chair. The man looked like he had gained more than one grey hair in the last few days. "What did Durza do?" asked Aragon, as a feeling of trepidation crept into him. Suddenly, unable to wait for Brahm's response, Aragon managed to push himself upright. He ignored Brahm's worried look and half-movement to help him or Saphira's protest. The pain and weakness hit him again, but he weathered it as he reached his arm around to feel his back. "Aragon," said Brahm warningly, but the rider had already felt it. The start of a half-inch wide scar that stretched from his right shoulder to his opposite hip. Horror mixed with shock filled him as he sank back down into the bed and closed his eyes. The price, thought Aragon, was high. Too high. "Little one," said Saphira worriedly. "Aragon," asked Brahm again. This time the worry was plain in his voice, as he no longer tried to hide it. "I'm fine," said Aragon honestly, for as he had come to realize, he was fine. The words of the figure in white on the cliffs came back to him. Follow Arya. He had a purpose, a place to go for answers and help. No, he may bear a scar, but that did not mean he could not be the rider the Varden needed. Enjoying the feeling of Saphira's comforting presence, he sent his father a smile. "Really, I think I just want to sleep." Brahm nodded and settled back in the chair. "Then do." Aragon was just drifting off when Brahm said softly, "Selena would have been proud of you." "Yes," thought Aragon as sleep claimed him. "It won't be easy, but it's too late to go back. Besides, I'm not sure I want to any more." Revised. 127-2013, Book Lover 19. You have been one step ahead of me. I just revised both the pre-battle and battle chapter. I'm rather proud of my mirror mirror on the wall scene in the pre-battle one. These revisions are kind of fun. I understand that my decision in the previous chapter is a bit controversial, but to be honest, it isn't a very radical shift. You have actually been reading it, for the most part, in all of my revised chapters. When I write, that is the way it comes out on the page, and it goes against my natural style to constantly be changing it. I have actually been forcing myself to write that way in my other story, City of Verity. But since I began Zoe so long ago, and that decision was made a year ago, it seemed like too much work to change 20 chapters to another style, and it has become part of Zoe's character when I write her. As far as school and FF accounts, no worries. I just thought then I would be able to PM you instead of leaving these little messages at the bottom of the chapter, but whatever works for you also works for me. I understand about school. I attend one of those. Try balancing it with a competitive sports schedule. The pure craziness that is my life. Writing is one of my stress releases, and so I make some time for it. Easier for me now that my departmental exams for semester one are over. But I am very sympathetic about the pressure to be an academic all-star. Happy reading to you, luckyponygirl. 29. To change fate. Aragon stepped around the twisted and charred body of an Urgle, only half listening to the sounds of women grieving as they searched the battlefield for the bodies of loved ones. Behind him walked Saphira, who was doing her best to avoid stepping on the bodies of men and Urgles. The glittering blue of her scales was the only color in the gloom that filled the hollow mountain. Even the city of Trondheim seemed dimmed. Many of the streets were dark, and the lights of lanterns were spread out across the city. It was a poor comparison to the city it had been when he had first arrived. Then Trondheim had shone with thousands of lights. 6 days, thought Iragan since the battle, and yet the battlefield still looked as if the battle had raged the previous day. The sheer number of Urgal bodies had meant that the Varden was forced to burn them. No honored resting place for them. Instead, a fire had been built at one end of the hollow mountain, and the stench of burning flesh filled the air. It was also 6 days since he had challenged Durza with Zoe by his side. 3 since the destruction of the star Sapphire. 3 since he had woken to find his wound healed. It had been 3 days since the mysterious figure who had saved him, and 3 since people had begun to call him Shadeslayer. A title that would once have made him feel strong and proud, but now made him feel heavy. The price of that act was only now making itself apparent. Since Angela had allowed him up and about, he had tried to assist in the recovery. On each and every occasion, even if the act was as small as picking up a broken sword, he had experienced a dull ache that would increase in intensity until he stopped and rested. The pain came from his new scar, and while Angela and Arya had been unable to find anything wrong with him, Zoe had been able to explain it to him. The pain, she had told him, was a curse left by the Shade. According to her, the attacks were not as serious as they had been in the history she knew, but she could not say whether or not they would increase in severity as time passed. The reason, she thought, was because she had protected him with her own shield the minute Durza was destroyed, and this had prevented the Shade from worsening the curse his death had laid on Iragan. Her only piece of advice was to limit his physical activity as much as possible, and as he was still very much recovering, it was not as hard as it might have been. Iragan stopped and glanced around. He was in the center of the battlefield, and he was still unsure of why he had come here. Perhaps it was the desire to see the destruction and the pain that had been unleashed here, or maybe just to confirm that the battle was truly over. He did not know, nor was he sure he really wanted to know. The ground he stood on was moist with blood, and in some places the bodies were piled on top of each other. Iragan had come to the conclusion that whether you were a man or a dwarf or an Urgal, you died the same. Death was an equalizer of the most powerful kind. At one point, it seemed so long ago now, he may have been destroyed by the carnage that lay around him. Now, instead of horrifying him, it numbed him to the core. This numbness allowed him to sleep at night, to walk among the bodies like he did now, and to speak of the battle without shivering in recollection. To reach this state of mind had taken Saphira's help, as well as the words of Zoe and Arya. But as he found out from them, the only way to keep his sanity was to keep busy. If there was one thing he had learned from this battle, it was that the stories of glorious war were as far from the truth as it was possible to get. The only glory or honor was in saving innocent lives in the future. If he had to fight 1,000 wars, he would do it for the peace that would follow. Glancing back at the city, he thought of his friends and father. Zoe and Arya were probably embroiled in a council to help get the Varden back on its feet. His young friend had proved very capable in organizing supplies, messages, and other details, while Arya also assisted in the healing of soldiers. Brahm was most likely assisting them, as well as providing leadership, while Ajahad continued to ferret out Urgals who had escaped in the dwarf tunnels. Murtagh had returned to the patrols the previous day, though Zoe had been strangely worried about it. In fact, Zoe had been strangely on edge for the past few days, and while Iragan put it down to the battle, he was unsure if there was more to it than that. Then there was the drama of Naswada that occurred 2 days previously. Ajahad's daughter had remained behind to fight in the battle, and her father's anger had been nearly as fierce as a dragon's when roused. Zoe had later confided to him that she had known of Naswada's plan, but had not wanted to deny the other woman the chance to fight for her people. While Iragan still struggled with the concept of a woman in battle, his time with both Zoe and Arya had shown that gender was no hindrance for skill. He smiled inwardly at what Zoe would have said had she known his thoughts. I will be leaving soon, thought Iragan. It was true. He had already made plans with Arya to leave within the next week. He had yet to see if Zoe would accompany him. Brahm had told him that he would be remaining with the Varden, and Murtagh would most likely remain with him. Things were still too vague and undefined, but Iragan already knew he would miss his father and his half-brother. He had grown used to having them by his side, not to mention Zoe. You will still have me, said Saphira in his mind. The dragon and rider continued their walk through the fields of the dead. "I know," he said with a smile, "but it will be strange not to have Brahm around or Murtagh or Zoe. I've grown used to having them watching my back and offering advice. You will meet up with them again. Maybe, but that does not make any less strange." Skirting the body of a dead horse, Iragan stopped again and wondered idly if he should return to the city. He could not suppress the feeling of dread. Turning meant facing the Varden and pretending he was stronger than he really was. The feeling of another mind reaching out to touch his made Iragan tighten the barriers he had kept around him since the battle. Iragan, the voice of Brahm echoed through the link, and Iragan lowered his boundaries to allow his father to speak better to him. "What?" asked the rider. Through their bond, he knew Saphira was listening to their conversation. "Ajahad is returning along with Murtagh. Meet me and the others at the west gate of Trondheim. Saphira and I will be there." Carefully scrambling onto Saphira's back, he did not bother with the straps as the dragon took flight and began to angle towards the gate. Iragan smiled slightly. He was certain that without Saphira's constant support these last few days, he would not have survived. If anything, his injury and the events surrounding it had only deepened their bond. As Iragan and Saphira rounded Trondheim, a small group became visible against the white marble of the city walls. Among them was the dwarf Auric, who was impatiently shifting from leg to leg and holding his axe tightly in one hand. Beside him was Arya, looking aloof and calmly regal. The white bandage around her arm gleamed in the light cast by one of the dwarven lights. Zoe was not there, to Iragan's surprise, but Brahm was along with Jormungandr. Saphira landed beside the small group and they exchanged greetings. Voicing a question, Iragan asked, "Where is Zoe? I thought she would be here." Brahm shrugged. "I have not seen her for the last few hours, nor have I been able to contact her. She must be busy somewhere else." Nodding, Iragan and the others fell silent. He and Saphira spoke of little inconsequential things, merely enjoying each other's presence and words in the privacy of their minds and bond. It was then that they saw the shape of figures in the tunnel. I stood in the shadow of the entrance to the tunnel. My plan was simple: stay hidden and let the group of warriors leave the tunnel, warn Murtagh with my mind, and then intercept the Urgles before they could completely overrun the group and stay as close to Murtagh as possible. If Ajahad survived, then he did. If he did not, then I would worry about that later. There were forces at work that were far more powerful than me, and Ajahad's fate was in their hand. I gripped my bow even tighter with my sweaty hands. Where were they? The longer I stood here, the more nervous I got. I had no idea of how long I'd been there, nor did it really matter. All that mattered was what was coming, and the game of fate I was about to play, that I was playing. As I waited in the shadows, I thought back over the last few days. Since Iragan had woken, I had been swept into the inner workings of the Varden, and I had found myself remembering more and more of my previous life. Making lists of supplies, organizing this, and that had been a familiar part of my routine as princess and then commander in my home. The intricacies of diplomacy and the organizing of an army was nothing strange to me, but it was exhausting. The Council of Elders, a group of Varden leaders, was also less than keen to see Brahm, who was acting for Ajahad until he returned, hand over so much power to a relatively unknown quadrant. I may be a hero in the eyes of the people, but I was a usurper to the council. They had grudgingly moved aside and allowed me the freedom I needed to act. To my surprise and relief, I found that King Hrothgar was more than willing to work with me. Because the Varden and dwarves were so interconnected, it had required that any decision made regarding supplies, weapons, and ect had to include the dwarves. I met with the Dwarf King 3 times, and on all 3 occasions, I left feeling like I had managed to accomplish something. Hrothgar was a cunning and effective leader who was more than open to listening to me and my suggestions. It was refreshing, and I think I even managed to turn some of his wary and stubborn advisors to my side. Then there was Iragan. I had held on to the faint hope that, somehow, Durz's awful curse had been avoided, but that hope was quickly dashed. However, there was no point wishing things would go easier for Iragan. In some ways this was a good thing, and there was nothing I could do to change it. Nothing any of us, from Angela to Arya to Brahm to me, did it help Iragan at all. So for the last few days, Iragan had mostly stayed with Saphira in an empty guard room on the upper levels, or flying within the city mountain. He would meet up with me, Arya and Brahm usually in the evening. In other words, he remained as far as possible from the adoring, cheering crowds of the Varden. I was forced to smile ever so slightly as my thoughts drifted to Naswada. In preparation for whatever occurred in the future, I had included her in many of the meetings and discussions I had been a part of during the last few days. Naswada had also been assigned too many tasks by Brahm, who already respected and sympathized with her and the challenges she faced. Not everyone, namely the Council of Elders, had been pleased by this development, nor had Ajahad been at all pleased to discover what Naswada had been up to during the battle. Enough of that now. You must be wondering exactly I am. I have already told you that I am in the entrance of the West Tunnel, but not what this tunnel and the ground outside looks like. As terrain is a rather important thing, when planning for a fight I shall do my best to describe my surroundings to you. This particular tunnel was quite tall, maybe 15 or so feet tall, and was the most used by dwarves coming from the dwarven cities in the west. It was wide enough for 3 or 4 horses to walk abreast quite comfortably. The ground rose up in a gentle slant to the entrance, and then leveled out as you left it. The gently glowing lights that the dwarves used were placed every few feet along the wall. A few rocks littered the ground, and I made careful note of them so I would not trip. There is one key thing you should know. There was a sharp corner about 50 feet inside the tunnel before it straightened out and led to the surface. This corner created a convenient way of ambushing someone from behind. Sound familiar? I was nestled in a nook created by door and the wall. The shadows here were thick, and I had not moved from this place for the last hour or so. I forced myself to stay relaxed, and I occasionally flexed my muscles to try and keep them ready for the upcoming fight. In the last few days I had done my best to create a plan that was simple and yet answered 3 important problems. The first was that there was still one twin alive who would no doubt want revenge on the Varden. I suspected that he would be part of this mission, and so I had to contend with a magic user. Problem number 2 was that this was a Protect Murtagh mission, but actually doing that was another matter entirely. I would have to be quick on my feet and make sure he knew to be watching for an attack, whether it was a physical or mental one. Problem number 3 was Ajahad. In many ways, despite how horrible it sounds, reader, I would rather he died. Nusoda was the leader, the Varden leader for the upcoming trials. Yet I could not reconcile myself with not trying to do all I could to save him. As I mentioned before, my plan was to warn Murtagh and make sure that I was close to him and Ajahad when they attacked. I did not want to become surrounded by Urgles because, frankly, I probably could not survive that. So I was going to wait until the last possible moment and hope like mad it worked. It was then that I began to sense consciousnesses coming towards me from the dark depths of the tunnel. A quick check confirmed that they were indeed the party of warriors that included both Murtagh and Ajahad. My hand tightened around my bow, and I silently drew an arrow out of my quiver. My heartbeat sped up, and I felt the tingling rush of adrenaline as it began to course through my veins. I rolled my shoulders a few times and prepared myself as best I could for what was to come. It was then that the group rounded the corner, and I saw Murtagh near the center, and Ajahad was in front. Quickly sending out my mind, I found the Urgles not far behind. A little farther back I found the heavily armored mind of the twin. A little spark of anger rose inside of me as I touched his slimy and nasty mind. Bringing my mind back to the rapidly approaching group, I slipped into both Murtagh's and Ajahad's minds, and without speaking to them, I filled their senses with a feeling of impending doom. I had done this before Iragan and Brahm were attacked by the Razak so long ago outside of Drasleona. It had worked there, and it worked again. My warning made the already wary Murtagh and battle-hardened Ajahad instantly double the defenses around their minds and grip their sword hilts all the tighter as they readied themselves for whatever was coming. I could not stop myself from sending a similar warning to all those in the group. I was not as selfish or cold-blooded as to deny them the same warning as I gave Murtagh. They all deserved to live, but I could protect all of them, and so this would have to do. The group of warriors passed by my hiding place just as the Urgles reached the sharp corner. I slowed my breathing and sent a quick prayer to whoever listened to them. This was it. The warriors were almost all the way outside when the Urgles surged from behind and sending a final burst of warning to Murtagh. I raised my bow and fired. The silver shaft found its mark in the neck of one of the Urgles, and a second quickly removed another one of the creatures. I heard the sounds of warnings and shouts coming from the men, but the Urgles were already on me. Whipping out my sword, I quickly stepped back into the light of the tunnel, which blinded the Urgles as they left the dark shadows of the tunnel. However, this advantage did not last for long, and within moments I was surrounded by a mix of Varden's soldiers and Urgles. No one had time or desire to ask where I had just come from, which was awesome because fighting was what we all needed to concentrate on. Then we could deal with questions, as long as we were all alive. I saw Murtagh a little ways to my right, and I did my best to fight my way to him. He sent me a confused look, but there was no time for words, and so we found ourselves fighting together, our swords flashing beside one another as we fought the Urgles. Ajahad was obscured by the Urgles, but there was little time to wonder if he was still alive or not. It was then that I felt the touch of that twin's mind. The awful feeling of that touch made me react as strongly as I had ever reacted to the touch of another's mind. I literally punched his daylights out with my own mind, and the pain of the blow sent the twin scrambling behind his barriers. However, the twin was not as strong as I had suspected. He must be severely weakened after the death of his brother. Slashing an Urgle through the heart, I sent another mental attack towards the twin, and this time I crushed his barriers ruthlessly. Let me tell you, dear reader, I took multitasking to another whole level. I was still surrounded by Urgles, still had to fight as hard as I could and make sure Murtagh stayed safe, but I was also taking control over the twin. A well-aimed smack with my bow to the side of the head, followed by a slash of my sword, finished off an Urgle. At the same time, another mental attack knocked the twin out. It was then, as happens in many small but intense fights, everything is over. Murtagh was standing beside me. We were both panting hard, and both our blades were stained red with Urgle blood. I saw 4 Urgles, who had managed to survive, running back into the tunnel. A quick glance around showed me that Murtagh and I were surrounded by both the bodies of both men and Urgles. Without really considering what I was doing, I sent Murtagh a quick glance and said, "Stay here." He opened his mouth to say something, but I did not wait. Instead, I leapt forward and back into the dark mouth of the tunnel. My sword glowed slightly, and by its light I saw the quickly retreating backs of the Urgles. Running as fast as I could, I followed them, but they were far faster than I was. As I rounded the corner, I saw the limp body of the twin slumped against the wall. The Urgles had left him behind in their haste to escape. I came to a sliding stop in front of the unconscious man. It was then that I saw that the Urgles had decided to put an end to him as they made their escape. They must have decided that he was a useless extra to carry with them as they tried to outrun the Varden. A crude black Urgle blade had been thrown through his heart, and the blood was staining the white of his already filthy and blood-stained clothes. I did not know what to do. Looking at the dead man before me, it was hard, so hard, reader, to see the kind of man who was so hungry for power he would betray thousands. Shaking my head, I wiped my sword clean and sheathed it. I had to return to the others and see if Ajahad had made it through or not. Turning away, I hurried away from the dead body and the chill of death that hung around it. The fate of the twins was a reminder that greed and a lust for power never ended happily. I stopped briefly at the 2 Urgles I had killed with my arrows to retrieve those shafts before heading back outside. Those arrows were from my old home, and I could not bear to just discard them like regular arrows. The familiar stench of death greeted me as I emerged, and saw a few of the soldiers who had managed to survive checking the bodies of those who had not, in the hopes they might still live. Over half of the warriors who had ridden with Ajahad had not survived the attack despite my warnings. Of the 4 dwarven guides who had been with them, I only saw one standing. However, those were not the ones I was most worried about. I searched for Murtagh and saw him cleaning his blade beside Saphira. He looked relatively unharmed, but it was then that my eyes fell on the group huddled beside a body. A cold chill crept over my heart, and the world flashed in front of my eyes as I realized just what had happened. My suspicion was confirmed as I saw the identical expressions of grief, pain, and horror on Arya, Iragan, and Brahm's faces. For lying on the dark ground surrounded by dead Urgles and the bodies of the men who had tried to protect him was Ajahad of the Varden. 30 Outcomes. This is a pretty big chapter, but I hope it's okay and you enjoy it. As always, thank you to everyone who has read, reviewed, and favorited this story. With a little luck, I will get some chapters posted pronto. Once again, thank you so much. Luckyponygirl, now I want to hit the pause button for a second. Yes, I know this is a moment filled with tension, horror, grief, pain, and lots of other explosive emotions, but I think you need a little filling in. So let's pretend that everything has stopped for a second, and your trusty guide me is giving you a little information about your visit to this lovely, charming, violent world that is also known as Alagaesia. Settle back and get comfortable because, in my whole little rundown earlier, I forgot to tell you something. Something you really need to know so that you don't start hating me. First off, Ajahad is a pretty awesome leader. He knows how to inspire his men to fight even when they know they will most likely end up dead on the battlefield. He knows how to be a diplomat, and he can duel with words as well as with a sword. Not only that, but he is a pretty great father and a loyal friend. In other words, if there were more Ajahads in the world, we would not have half the problems we do. Now why, you the confused and irritated reader asks, is this important? This whole little thing is disruptive and annoying. Well, I beseech you from the depths of my heart to listen and try and see the whole situation from my view, because I am feeling about as guilty as it is possible to get. In fact, take that amount of guilt and multiply it by 1,000, and then add on grief and all the rest of it. It makes for one super ugly mess, and here is the kicker. It was my fault, my choice, and my actions that had led to this moment. I had told myself that saving Murtagh was priority, but that Ajahad's fate was a key part of this entire story. It was his death that led Naswada to the position of leader. I had seen how protective he was of Naswada, and there was no way he would ever allow her the freedom she would need to do what she had to do for the Varden. Ajahad could not be the leader that the Varden needed in the coming battles. He lacked the charismatic courage of his daughter, who, unlike her father, had not been chilled by decades of fighting a seemingly hopeless cause. No, I had chosen to allow Ajahad's fate to play out as it will. It had been a choice which I both accepted and hated with all my heart. Yet, while my reasons were sound, my conscience told me that I had as good as murdered Ajahad. I knew that saving Ajahad would have drastically changed the future. Yet knowing and believing are two different things, and so, in the days leading up to this moment, I had spent most of my time trying to forget just what I was about to do. My choice to do all I could to save Murtagh had a selfish aspect to it that I could not forget. I may have thought saving him would be a good thing, but it was also because I did not want to think of him under the cruel influence of Galbatorix. But now, you know, my choices have been made. The dice cast and the pieces on the board have moved forward. By saving Murtagh, I failed to save Ajahad. By saving Murtagh, I have changed the path on which this world walks. My reasons, to give Naswada the chance she needs to become a leader, meant the death of her father. Now you maybe understand a little more. At least I hope so. I hope you understand that I am only a girl who made a choice, a gamble, and finds that no matter the result, she would have hated it anyways. I would have hated myself for saving Ajahad, but not Murtagh. I would have hated myself for saving both and risking the lives of uncounted billions of innocent bystanders. I hate myself for saving Murtagh, but failing Ajahad. I hope that you know that no matter how powerful or clever I appear, it is only an illusion. I am a girl who is scared, who is out of her element, and who is trying to make choices that will affect more than just her. I may be a good hand with weapons, gifted with a royal title and bloodline, friends with some of the most powerful people in this world and my own, but I'm not that different from you in a lot of ways. All right, that's all I wanted to say. We can hit the play button again, and we'll pretend this little explanation never happened. You can get back to reading, and I can get back to the moment. I'll keep telling you everything, and you'll keep silent. Maybe one day we'll meet, and you can tell me exactly what you think of all this over a cup of Starbucks. Or maybe you'll just keep silent, keep watching, and then just shut this book and walk away. I don't mind either way, but I want you to understand, to know. My heart was in my throat. I suddenly could not move or breathe or speak or do anything but stare at the scene in front of me. What have I done? I asked myself again and again. What have you done, Zoe? The words pounded through my mind with all the force of a stampeding herd of elephants. The scene in front of me was too familiar, too awful for me to truly take it all in. Suddenly, I found myself moving. In what seemed no time at all, I was kneeling beside Arya and Brahm, staring at the dead man in front of me. Ajahad's noble, dark face was set in a calm mask. If not for the blood and the death surrounding him, you could almost have said he was sleeping. His armor was rent with numerous tears, and his sword had been broken halfway down the blade. I looked to Brahm and met his shocked, grief-filled eyes. In a soft, almost accusing voice, he asked, "Did you know?" I bent my head and felt the tears rise as I fought to speak. "Yes," I whispered hoarsely. I knew, and I tried, but I couldn't finish. My voice died as raw, cold failure filled me. Brahm sighed. "It doesn't matter." Yet it mattered so much, and I could not forget that. Brahm's voice, it seemed so far away, came again. "Iragan, remember what he told you." "I will," said Iragan numbly. Arya rested a hand on my shoulder and pushed herself upright. "The wounded and the dead must be cared for." Her voice seemed to echo far longer than it should have. I rose beside her, my eyes never leaving Ajahad's face. "Yes," I managed to say. I forced myself upright and looked at Murtagh, who was still standing beside Saphira. Our eyes met, and I saw in their dark depths a question. It was a question that I was sure I would be answering many times in the next few days. What was supposed to happen? Why? The next few hours passed in a blur of sound and motion. I was distantly aware of Brahm taking temporary command of the Varden and of the outpouring of grief when the news of Ajahad's death spread. I knew that Jormungandr, along with a company of warriors, arrived not long after, and that I informed him of the dead twin and the Urgel's escape into the tunnels. Yet my body was just going through the motions, my emotions just under control, as I placed a blank mask on my face. I do not consciously remember walking to the citadel or why I decided to return to my own room, but I did. It was there, in the quiet, tastefully decorated room that had once belonged to Glenwing, one of Arya's elven companions, that I tried to come to terms with everything. I did it by lying on my bed, still armed, and in my blood-spattered clothes, and going over, with methodical care, every single reason and act that had led me to this moment. No one disturbed my careful ordering of events and reasons until the light in the hollow mountain dimmed and became dusky. By that time, I had come to a fragile peace with myself and my actions. It was then that I heard a knock on my door. The sound startled me, for I had been lost among my memories and thoughts. Quickly gathering myself together, I said, "Come in." I pushed myself upright and swung my legs over the edge of the bed so my feet rested on the floor. It was then that the door opened to show Murtagh, and behind him was Brahm. The two of them had similar looks of concern, and they looked at me as if worried I might suddenly break down in tears or order them to leave. Had I not been so miserable, I might have found it rather amusing. "Brahm," I said quietly. "Murtagh." Murtagh moved forward and sat down on the edge of bed beside me. Tentatively, and with a shy kind of look in his eyes, he placed one arm around my shoulders, and when I did not protest, he drew me closer into his embrace until I was leaning my head on his shoulder. Brahm sat down on a spare chair and gazed at me, his eyes unreadable. Finally, his voice sounding strained in the silence, Brahm said, "What will happen now, Zoe?" His question was simple but so complex that I did not even know where to begin. Finally, I decided on a course of action. "I do not know, Brahm. I do not know. We walk on untried ground. Already things have changed." I thought of Elva, the child who had yet to be blessed cursed by Iragan. That was another key player who had been removed from my meddling, at least so far that was how it looked. What to do about that was a complete mystery to me. Elva was the reason Naswada was not killed by assassins multiple times. How was it supposed to have gone? Asked Murtagh softly. I closed my eyes as I remembered the plot line, or what remains of the plot line after I scrambled it. You were supposed to be captured and taken to Galbatorix by the twins. Ajahad died and Naswada took control of the Varden. Which then, I thought, made you into a dragon rider and a traitor. It also resulted in you falling in love with Naswada and finally letting go of your fury. All in all, it's a pretty grim fate you got. Well then, said Brahm in a businesslike way, we will just have to try and keep everything going according to plan. I stared at him. Of all the things I had expected him to say, that was not one of them, and nor did his bring-it-on attitude seem appropriate for the circumstances. What? I asked. How do you intend to do that? I do not want to remain leader of the Varden, but I can force the Council of Elders to choose Naswada as my replacement. Brahm drew out his pipe and happily began to puff away at it as if this was just another day in the office. I nodded, too stunned by his words to say anything, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence until Brahm spoke again. You cannot blame yourself for Ajahad's death, Zoe. Despite everything you know, you will not be able to save everyone. I smiled grimly. I know, Brahm. I know all too well. Brahm nodded and stood. I never thought it possible, but the tasks I must attend to has only doubled now. The Varden are reeling now from two great losses, and the dwarves are as stubborn as the marble they carve when it comes to what will be done about Ajahad's death. This is why I left the Varden. The old man rose from the chair and made his way to the door, only to stop and gaze back at Murtagh and I. Zoe, he stopped, and then continued. You must make a choice regarding where you will go as the Varden prepares to move towards open combat. I nodded, but said nothing, and so Brahm, with one last concerned look, left and closed the door quietly behind him. Murtagh and I were still for a long time until he said, What would have happened to me? I know you said I would have been taken to Galbatorix, but what then? I looked out the window. It was approaching dinner time, and yet I was not hungry or even that sleepy. You would have been forced into his service. What happens then is not something I wish to delve into. Your fate has changed. Ah, said Murtagh, and he pulled me closer. So you saved me. Yes, I whispered. I buried my face in his tunic. He must have changed it, for this one was clean and soft, not grimy from the tunnels and the fight afterwards. His sword was still at his side, but he no longer carried his bow, and he must have had a bath, for he smelled fresh and clean. For a few long seconds, I just breathed in his scent and tried to find the words for what I wanted to convey. I choose to save you. But Murtagh, I paused and raised my eyes to his dark, unreadable ones. You must promise me you will do all you can to safeguard yourself. I do not want you to be captured by the Empire later on. He smiled ever so slightly. I'll do my best, Zoe. I have no wish to lose my freedom ever. Now come on. He rose and pulled me upright. Dinner is soon if we have not already missed it. I nodded and said, I should also inform Iragan of the hailstorm he is about to be caught in. What? Asked Murtagh with a smirk. What kind of hailstorm? One created by the Council of Elders in their desperate bid to secure him, and by extension Naswada. Why not let him walk into it? He has to learn politics sooner than later. Because, I said, as we left my room and navigated the sitting room, it would be better for his future independence if he found a way of avoiding the position they will force him into. I'm not going to give him all the answers, but enough that he does not find himself in a corner with no way out. Murtagh stopped me just before the door that led to outside chamber. Zoe, he said very seriously, and I was slightly stunned to see the level of compassion and love that sparkled in his eyes. Thank you. Thank you for saving me today. I know how difficult it is for you to change the future, but I could not imagine losing my freedom to Galbatorix. I smiled, the first true smile I had managed that day. Suddenly everything seemed a little easier to bear. Don't mention it, Murtagh. I felt my nose begin to itch, the first sign of tears. But before I could say any more, Murtagh opened the door and led me out into the corridor. As we walked down the corridor, I made a mental list of what I needed to accomplish. It was a daunting list, but if I was going to go meddling with fate, this was a minor detail. Iragan roused himself and rolled to the edge of the bed. From his horizontal view, he examined the white-walled room he had been given to share with Saphira. Since the destruction of the Star Sapphire, he and Saphira had moved to an empty guard room near the top of the city. A wide balcony at the end of the corridor allowed Saphira the room she needed to take off, but the place was far enough removed that few ventured down this particular corridor. The room itself was high-ceilinged with large windows that overlooked the eastern side of the city. It was a nice enough place, and just large enough for Saphira's bulk to fit comfortably. A glance at his still sleeping dragon made his young rider smile. Since using fire for the first time, Saphira had been justifiably proud of herself. She could now summon a blustering inferno and used every occasion to flaunt it. As she slept, he could see flames flickering within her wide nostrils, and the occasional puff of smoke made the air inside the room a little hazy. Pushing himself upright, Eragon stretched his tight muscles. His peaceful mood quickly evaporated as he remembered the events of the previous day. Remembering Ajihad's death and the outpouring of grief that resulted was not the only thing the rider thought of. For while he had respected the leader of the Varden, he was not close enough to mourn his loss as he would a close friend. The loss of Ajihad, therefore, was a loss that hurt and numbed him, but not as severely as the loss of Brahm or Zoe or Murtagh would have. He grimaced as he remembered how things stood the previous night. Auric rushing off to give King Hrothgar the tidings, Jormungandr taking Ajihad's body to place where it would rest until the funeral, and Arya who stood alone and watched the goings-on. Brahm had taken temporary leadership, and Eragon had not seen where Zoe or Murtagh had gotten to. He knew that Murtagh had a minor injury from the skirmish in front of the tunnel, but he had not spoken to his half-brother. I wonder where Zoe is, thought Eragon. It was true. He had barely been aware of her presence the previous day, and yet Eragon also knew that she would most likely blame herself for Ajihad's death. That is one burden I am glad not to have, thought Eragon grimly. Saphira gave a small puff of smoke and stretched her front talons as she awoke. The warmth and love that spread from her mind to his made the rider smile. Good morning, little one. The same to you, Saphira. Anyone tried to contact us? No, she said with a contented puff of smoke. I have been fast asleep. For a moment the two of them basked in each other's comforting presence. Eragon smiled and rose and pulled on some clean, dark grey clothes that had been left for him. He stopped in front of the mirror and gazed at his reflection. It was not the face he remembered from Carvahall or Term or even from a few days ago. The face in front of him was more angular, the eyes more shadowed, and an air of heavy watchfulness seemed to hang around it. No, it was not the same face, but that was a good thing. Eragon, the Eragon he was now, could not have kept the same childish dreams and soft features. Turning away from the mirror, Eragon strapped on Zarok and his bow. The bow, a gift from Garrow, was looking a little worse for wear after the experiences of the last few months. Stepping towards the door, Eragon felt the gentle touch of another mind on his heavily armored mind. It was a familiar touch. Zoe's voice emanated from the link. Eragon. Zoe. He greeted her. Would you meet me in the dining hall, the one closest to you? I need to speak to you and Saphira. We will be there soon. With that she withdrew, and Eragon and Saphira left their room. Together they made their way through Trondheim toward the nearest kitchen. It was still early enough that the corridors were mostly deserted, but the few people they did see would bow to them and murmur Argetlam or Shadeslayer. Even the dwarves made the motions, though not as often. The humans Eragon saw wore their grief openly. Everyone wore black, and many women had black lace veils covering their faces. As they walked, the two discussed current matters. I worry that the Varden may expect me to seize leadership. Remember Ajihad's words, to keep the Varden strong. It could be taken as his blessing to become its leader. That does not seem like a wise path to take. We have to leave the Varden for Du Weldon Varden, and we cannot govern it from afar. No, I agree. Arya wouldn't approve, and she could be a dangerous enemy. Who out of the Varden has the skill and determination, though? Brahm does not want the position, but he may be forced to take it if there is no worthy candidate. However, I think he would rather influence events from behind the scenes, as he always has. We will be forced to weigh in with our own opinion. I won't ignore the strength we have. We wield great power within the Varden. Too little time has passed since we came to Varden for us to know what its other leaders are like. We will have to form an opinion on our feelings and impressions without the benefit of history. They arrived at the kitchen a little while later, and Eragon brought a platter of food to a low table. He had just sat down when Zoe appeared from one of the passages and walked towards him. She was dressed, as always, in her dark leather clothing, and her weapons swung at her side. Her face was grave, Eragon, though he had never seen her look so serious, yet despite that she looked remarkably unchanged. She could have dropped out of the sky only yesterday. Eragon, she greeted him. Sapphira, the blue dragoness hummed deeply as Zoe scratched her above her eyes. Zoe, said Eragon as he picked at his food. You wanted to talk. Yes, she said as she took a seat in front of him, and then, to his surprise, she switched to the ancient language as if she did not want anyone to eavesdrop. I need to talk to you about the coming politics you are about to be embroiled in. Mentally switching to the new language, Eragon said, What needs to be said? Zoe reached out and slipped a piece of bread from his plate. In response to his raised eyebrow and amused laugh, she said defensively, I haven't had any breakfast. Then go get some, said Eragon, pointing at the kitchen. He could not stop from smirking as Zoe rolled her eyes. Back to more important matters, said the girl as she tried and failed to sound stern. You're about to be embroiled in some pretty intense politics. This is about the leadership, isn't it? Asked Eragon. Yes, said Zoe, and any sign of amusement left her as her expression returned to a serious frown. You and Sapphira are going to have to deal with the Council of Elders. I told you about them. Eragon nodded, remembering Zoe's frustrated comments about the council. Zoe continued, They are desperate to secure your loyalty. To do this, they are going to suggest, or rather force you and Sapphira into a corner so that you support their choice of Naswada. This, in their eyes, will make them appear more powerful. To ensure you do not back out, they will force you to swear fealty to the Varden. Is Naswada a good choice? Asked Eragon. He had forgotten about his food as he gazed intently at Zoe. The two of them were impervious to their surroundings as they discussed these matters. Yes, said Zoe. She is, and she will be no puppet. However, you need to find a solution that prevents you from being forced to swear allegiance to either the Varden as a whole or Naswada. So, said Eragon, trying to make sure he understood exactly what Zoe was saying, if I swear fealty to the Varden, then the council thinks they will have more control over me. Check, said Zoe. If I swear to Naswada, then I will be her vassal and not truly independent. Check. What should we do? Asked Eragon. The rider was unable to keep the bite from his voice. The situation was too frustrating. Zoe shrugged. Make sure Brahm is with you when you meet the council. That should prevent them from doing anything to devious out of fear. If they do demand your loyalty, whether to increase moral or the strength of Naswada's position, then try to establish that, while you support the choice, you will be unable to so publicly declare it. You are stronger than any one fraction in the Varden right now. You can do as you wish, but it would be unwise to make too many enemies within the Varden. She smiled bitterly. It's a nasty situation all the way around. Why is me swearing fealty to Naswada a problem? If she is a capable leader, it should not have too many negative effects. Zoe toyed with the pommel of her sword for a moment before responding. It is a problem because you must remain independent of any one fraction. Even as we speak, Hrothgar is considering the possibility of inviting you to join his clan. This would make you an honorary dwarf. If you become too tied down with responsibilities, then your power as a rider will be greatly reduced. Ah, said Eragon. He was troubled at Zoe's news regarding Hrothgar. How would he manage to avoid that one? Before he could ask further questions, Zoe spoke again. I have two more subjects that need to be spoken about. Eragon and Sapphira waited patiently as the girl paused. The first is what happened yesterday, and the second is regarding who will travel with you to do Weldenvarden. Before you continue, Zoe, said Sapphira, you should know that both Eragon and I do not hold you responsible for Ajahad's death. Zoe shook her head. It's not that, Sapphira, though your words comfort me and ease my guilt. It is that I want you both to know that, while I will do all I can to help and ease your journey, I cannot, as I found out yesterday, save everyone. Whatever happens, I want you both to know that I will try my hardest, but that sometimes isn't enough. Eragon gazed at the girl in front of him. He had rarely heard her admit that she was not able to handle a situation, and that admission spoke of the level of trust and friendship between the three of them. Wanting to convey both his understanding and his support, Eragon said gently, You are our friend, Zoe. Nothing is going to change that. The rider had never been so glad for the ancient language and its demands for honesty, for this was the truth. Yes, said Sapphira firmly as she lowered her head to gaze eye to eye with Zoe. Nothing at all, little one. I only wish you would ask us for help more often. I might have to, Sapphira, said Zoe with a small, weak smile. The third thing I needed to talk with you about is Du Weldenvarden. I know that you two are planning on leaving soon. Brahm and I spoke briefly last night about me accompanying you. That way both the Varden and the dwarves can feel as if they have a representative during your training. Brahm was going to speak about it more with King Hrothgar and whoever takes the leadership, but I wanted to ask you too. You might come, asked Eragon. It felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted, and a little of the fear he had felt at traveling with only Arya to do Weldenvarden eased. Maybe, said Zoe with a smile, but Saphira would you be able to carry 3 too? If that is too difficult for you then it will not be possible. Eragon glanced up at Saphira, who was gazing appreciatively at the ceiling above her as if considering Zoe's question. Lowering her gaze back to the two of them, she said, I think I can. I would not be able to fly as fast nor as far, but it would be possible. You aren't that heavy, you know, nor is Arya. Zoe's smile widened, and she said, Thank you, Saphira. We will have to see what Brahm says. Wouldn't Murtagh prefer you to stay with the Varden? Asked Eragon curiously. He was not a blind fool, and had noticed the way the two treated each other. Even Arya had commented on how close the two were growing. Brahm had had some rather interesting comments about it. Zoe shrugged. I mentioned it to him, and we spoke of it. Murtagh is easy either way. While he would miss having me with him, he agrees with my reasons for going and supports it. I have made him promise not to get into any trouble, and Brahm will keep a close eye on him. He does not want Murtagh to be captured by the Empire and taken back to Galbatorix any more than me. Is that what was supposed to happen? Asked Eragon curiously. Yesterday, I mean. Zoe grimaced, and any levity left her quickly. Yes, she said heavily. Yes, it was. However, that is too dark a subject for right now. Eragon nodded and looked down at his uneaten and now cold food. Would you like this? He asked Zoe, gesturing at the plate. Zoe wrinkled her nose and examined the mix of potatoes, onions, mushrooms, and bread. Not a very balanced meal, is it? She said. No green vegetables and no protein. I think I'm okay for now. Protein? Asked Eragon curiously. Zoe had spoken the word in the common tongue and not in the ancient language. It was a strange word, and Eragon wondered what it meant. Yeah, said Zoe. A protein is a complex nutrient you get from meat, dairy products like cheese and nuts. It makes up many body structures and is important for healthy body functions. Oh, said Eragon. Zoe had given him many, as she called them, biology lessons on their travels that ranged from what turned milk sour to the laws that govern the world. The most fascinating topic had been genetics and how animals adapted to their various habitats. It was then that Saphira said, Eragon, Zoe, there is someone here who I can't scare away. Glancing around, Eragon saw a pale-looking youth standing a little ways from the table. The boy was glancing from Eragon and Zoe to Saphira, as if wondering who was going to try and kill him first. What is it? Asked Eragon in the common tongue. The boy started, flustered, then bowed. You have been summoned, Argetlam, to speak before the Council of Elders. Glancing at Zoe, Eragon said, Are you to lead me to them? Yes, I am. I suppose I'll see you later, Eragon, said Zoe with a smile. Sheeta spoke in the common tongue, and with a warm smile directed towards the boy she continued. I have to meet with 3 of the captains to discuss what is to be done about their depleted weapon supplies. The list of things to do goes on and on. With that she left, and leaving his uneaten food, Eragon motioned for the boy to show the way. Saphira followed behind, and as they walked, the boy admired Zarok with bright eyes, but was too shy to say anything. Remembering the days when he had been the boy's age and filled with hopes and dreams for heroic deeds, Eragon asked, What are you called? Joshua, sir. Saphira and I must thank you, Joshua. You carried your message well. Joshua sent him a small smile and then bounced forward. When they reached a convex stone door, the boy stopped and said, The council awaits you here, Argetlam. With that, he bowed and left. Eragon glanced back at Saphira for reassurance and then reached out and pushed the door open. The room inside was circular, with a blue domed ceiling that was painted with constellations. A round marble table, inlaid with the crest of Durgrinst in Jatum, stood in the center of the room. Seated at the table were Jormundur, 2 other men, one tall and one broad, a woman with a cold expression and elaborately painted cheeks, and a second woman with an immense pile of grey hair and belied by a dagger hilt peeking out of the vast hills of her bodice. Knowing that he was being watched, Iragan surveyed the room and then seated himself in the middle of a swath of empty chairs. A sense of desperation filled him when he noticed that Brahm was nowhere to be seen and that he was alone in this battle of words. Taking comfort from the presence of Saphira, who had hunkered down behind him, Iragan gazed steadily back at the 5 people gathered in this room. Jormundur got halfway up to make a slight bow, and then reseated himself, saying as he did so, "Thank you for coming, Iragan, Saphira. Before we can continue, we must wait for Brahm. Until he arrives, this is Umuth, the tall man, Falberd, the broad one, and Sabri and Elisari, the 2 women." Iragan inclined his head but said nothing. He was not disconcerted by the silence that came after Jormundur spoke. In fact, he welcomed the peace it brought to his tensed nerves. Few long minutes passed before the door opened once more, and this time both Arya and Brahm entered the chamber. Brahm sent him a brief, measured look before greeting the other council members. Arya sat down a few chairs away from Iragan, and she too looked at him briefly before turning her attention back to 5 council members. Iragan smiled inwardly. If the expressions on the faces of the members of the council were any indication, the presence of his father and Arya were not welcomed additions. Saphira chuckled through their link, and Iragan wondered what would come of this meeting. 31. A grab for power. A chapter, thank you to everyone, and as always, please review. When pleasantries were dealt with, the Council of Elders did not waste time. Instead, they got started with little to no banging around the bush. Tapping a long fingernail on the table, Sabri said, "A leader must be appointed, and quickly. Lord Brahm has already made it clear that he will only act as advisor." From his seat on one side of the round table, Jormundur spoke. "King Hrothgar has already contacted us to convey his condolences. While he was more than courteous, he is sure to be forming his own plans even as we speak. We must also consider Duvranga Gata. They are difficult to predict even at the best of times." "What is your suggestion for leader?" asked Brahm from his chair. Iragan was sure that Brahm already knew who he wished to support, but would only give his opinion once the others had. Falberd heaved himself up, planting his heavy hands on the table. "The 5 of us have already decided whom to support Lord Brahm. We all agreed on who would be the best, and we are confident that you, Lady Arya of Du Weldenvarden, and Ryder Iragan will support our choice." Waiting, wondering if Zoe would again prove right, Iragan watched the 5 councillors. Continuing on in his oily voice, Falberd said, "Naswada is our choice." Iragan glanced quickly at Arya, but she was as unreadable as ever. A quick glance of Brahm revealed nothing on how he felt about the suggestion. Turning his attention back to the councillors, he said to Saphira, "Zoe was right. They want a young, inexperienced leader." It was hard for Iragan to rein in his distaste. This was just a grab for power. Zoe is usually right about things like this. Yet Naswada has steel in her. She has proven that when she fought amongst the Varden, and Zoe thinks she will make a good leader. So does Brahm. Saphira's tail flicked from side to side as she watched the small little humans in front of her play their amusing games of power. The dragon did not understand why they could not simply say what they wanted. They had made it so obvious anyways. "I think that Naswada would be an excellent choice," said Brahm smoothly. "She is a capable young woman who has spent years observing how the Varden is run. I am sure that she will provide the determination and independence needed to run the Varden." Iragan stared at his father. Had Brahm just said independent? The council looked irritated. No, secretly furious would be a better description. Sabri's eyes had darkened alarmingly, and both Umuth and Falberd glanced at each other. Elisari just smiled, but it was the smile of a snake about to strike. Brahm continued with deliberate slowness. "If Naswada accepts, then she should be appointed directly after the funeral in 2 days. A new leader as capable as she will bring back the confidence the Varden needs right now." "Will the elves find Naswada's appointment agreeable?" asked Falberd, looking towards Arya. Arya stared at the man until he fidgeted under her forceful gaze, and then lifted an eyebrow. "I cannot speak for my queen, but I find nothing objectionable to it. Naswada has my blessing." The council did not relax, but instead turned their attention to Iragan and Saphira. Iragan gazed steadily back at them without saying anything. His silence and Saphira's seemed to unsettle the 5. Elisari pressed herself against the table's edge as she leaned forward. We also must ask Ryder Iragan. We want you to be present at the appointing. No one, not even Hrothgar, can complain about its legitimacy then. We also wish for you to pledge your support to the Varden. If the appointment of Naswada will bring hope, that would double it. Iragan did not even blink. The council's grab for power was so obvious that they might as well have spoken it outright. He could sense the tension rolling off both Brahm and Arya, but he did not need their assistance in this particular matter. Zoe had prepared this for him, and so, desperate to avoid the shackles they were trying to place on him, Iragan chose his words. Selecting a mild but cold tone, Iragan responded, "And why should I? Saphira and I have fought and killed alongside the Varden." He stopped and watched with grim amusement as the council moved uneasily in their seats. "You have brought the Varden victory by killing Durza. You wield a position of great strength and importance within the Varden. Besides, it would allow us to offer you and your dragon far more protection," Falbert said. Iragan inwardly rolled his eyes. He had killed Durza. If he hadn't, the council would not have been so eager to control him. "That is a nice way of putting it," snapped Saphira in his mind. She was angry to have been called dragon, as if she was simply an animal. "I am not finished yet," said Iragan soothingly in return, aware that he needed to end this game before he found himself in a position that was not defendable. Iragan spoke his next words slowly and with great care. "We have demonstrated our support for the Varden multiple times since our arrival. We shall be present for Naswada's appointment as a sign of our continued commitment to the cause." Iragan watched with amusement as the 5 councillors visibly relaxed. His words may have shocked them, but they had also demonstrated his own power and independence. His answer protected him from being forced to commit to giving his fealty to the Varden. Jormundur, from what Iragan had seen, was a good and honest man, but the others in this council made him uneasy. Brahm stepped in before the council could say anything else. "Naswada must be summoned and asked if she will accept the responsibility. We cannot continue until we know her answer." Jormundur called for Jasha, and with a few words sent the boy off for Naswada. While he was gone, the conversation fell into an uncomfortable silence. Iragan ignored the council, focusing instead on the complicated swirls of colors in the marble of the table. Behind him, Saphira blew the occasional warm gust of air across the back of his head. When the door opened again, everyone turned expectantly. Naswada, chin held high and eyes steady, entered the room. Her embroidered gown was the deepest shade of black, deeper even than her skin, broken only by a sash of royal purple around her waist. A small golden pendant hung from her neck and glimmered as it caught the light. The boy was dismissed. Then Jormundur helped Naswada into a seat. Greetings as well as condolences were exchanged. The young woman, while poised and quick in her responses, was tragically different from the energetic young woman he had met with Saphira in the dragon hold. Her father's death had changed her irrevocably. It was Brahm, as current leader of the Varden, who informed her of the reason she had brought to the council. "This is your time of mourning, Naswada, but we must resolve an issue that has arisen, and it must be dealt with quickly." Brahm paused and gazed intently at Naswada. "The Varden need a leader, and quickly. It has been universally agreed that you, as Ajahad's heir, should take command of the Varden." Naswada bowed her head. While her eyes shone with tears, her voice was steady when she replied to Brahm. "I never thought I would be called to take my father's place so young. Yet, as his daughter and as a member of the Varden, I will accept this duty." The Council of Elders, while obviously pleased by this news, was still distinctly upset at the way Brahm and Iragan had played them. It was a victory, but not the victory they had planned for. They had gained no control over Iragan, and Brahm was going to be standing in opposition to them if they tried to increase their own power. With a wide smile that did not reach his eyes, Umeth said, "Your acceptance gladdens us." "Yes," said Brahm with a sharp look at the man. "Any assistance I, Arya, Iragan, and Saphira, or the council can offer is yours. I believe nothing else needs to be discussed." Naswada nodded her head, and then, looking at Jormundur, she asked, "I would like to thank all of you for the arrangements you have made for my father's funeral. However, would you leave me now? I need time to consider what has been asked of me." Naswada placed her hands on the marble table in front of her. For a second, Iragan wondered if the council would accept being dismissed so soon, for Umeth looked like he was going to argue, and Elisari's eyes had turned dark. However, Falbard, with a wave of a massive hand, said, "Of course. If you need help, we are ready and willing to serve." With another sweeping gesture at the council to follow, he swept past the rest to the door, looking neither left nor right, as if everyone else was somehow beneath him. The thought amused Iragan. "Iragan, will you please stay?" asked Naswada, meeting his eyes briefly as Iragan pushed himself from his seat. With a nod, he lowered himself back into his chair, ignoring alert looks from the councillors. Falbard suddenly looked reluctant to leave and lingered on the threshold before leaving. Brahm sent him a small smile as he left, and Arya, the last to go, looked at him with eyes filled with worry and apprehension that she had concealed before. Naswada sat partially turned away from Iragan and Saphira. "We meet again, Ryder. You have not greeted me. I hope I not offended you." "No, my lady, you have not," said Iragan. A sudden wave of paranoia gripped him, and so, reaching through the barrier in his mind for the magic, he quickly intoned a spell that would ward off unwanted listeners. Sending Naswada a small smile, he said, "There, now we can talk without fear of being overheard." "I doubt Brahm would allow anyone near this room anyways." For a second, a smile played across Naswada's face as she relaxed a little into her chair. "But I thank you, Iragan." Iragan dipped his head in acknowledgement, and for a second he did not know what to say. Behind Iragan's chair, Saphira stirred, then carefully made her way around the table to stand before Naswada. She lowered her head until one sapphire eye met Naswada's black ones. The dragon stared at her for a full minute before snorting softly and straightening. "Tell her," said Saphira, "that we grieve for her and her loss. Also that her strength must become the Varden's when she assume Ajahad's mantle. They will need a sure guide." Iragan repeated her words, and then, after a brief hesitation, he continued, "I will say this to you, Naswada, because I am not sure what Ajahad meant or what its implications are. Before Ajahad died, he charged me to keep the Varden from falling into chaos. I want you to understand that I will always support and protect the Varden. I am also fairly certain that you are aware of what the council plans for you." "I am." The young woman sat a little straighter, her grief temporarily forgot. "But I will not make it easy for them. I thank you, both of you, for your words and support in these troubled times. I agree that my father's words should be kept quiet, for they could be taken as a blessing for you to take control of the Varden." Iragan smirked. No, Zoe was right, this was a leader, and any doubts he had quickly left him. The woman in front of him had lost her reserve. Now she was composed, but determined. Naswada was her father's daughter without a doubt. Dipping his head, Iragan tapped the marble table with one finger before saying, "I will openly tell you that the council had planned for me to openly commit my loyalty to the Varden. While unable to exact that promise from me, it would have made your position would be precarious indeed." Naswada let out a small laugh. "I did not give you enough credit for your skills with politics. It will be a pleasure to work with you, Iragan Shadeslayer. As I found out today," she said, rising from her chair. "I may not know you well or you Saphira, but I can see that any game that you play shall have an interesting end." Iragan rose as well and bowed ever so slightly to her. With another smirk, the rider said, "I agree with you, my lady." As he turned to leave, she spoke again. "Iragan, if you see Zoe, tell her I would be glad to speak with her." "I will," said Iragan. With that, he and Saphira left. As they walked away from the room, Iragan glanced out at the city. "I will be glad to leave this place, Saphira." "Yes," she agreed. "I wish for open sky where we can fly and fly without stopping or turning back." "Soon," said Iragan with a smile as he rested a hand on her warm side. Soon. Soon he would know the truth of who it was who had saved him when Durza had attacked him. Soon he would start to master the skills he would need to pose a threat to Galbatorix and his servants. Soon. I smiled pleasantly and bade farewell to 3 captains I had met with to discuss supplies. The meeting had gone as well as it could have, and with some luck, the issues the captains had had were resolved. I left the small chamber where such meetings were carried out and walked down the corridor towards the upper levels of the city. As I walked, I wondered what had occurred in the Council of Elders meeting with Iragan and Saphira. Had Iragan managed to avoid fealty, or was he still forced to give his word either to the Varden or to Naswada? I shook my head and turned my thoughts to the small stack of documents I had to take to Brahm. The papers were a list of supplies for the 3 companies of warriors I had met with that morning. Wishing for some peace and quiet, I quickly left the papers in the empty study that had once belonged to Ajahad before making my way to the library. Murtagh had told me that he was going to spend the day trying to catch up on sleep and staying out of the way. He had no wish, he told me, to be caught up in the politics swirling around. The library was deserted and perfectly quiet. I smiled at the blessed relief of solitude and made my way through the shelves until I found a particularly comfortable armchair. I chose a random book from the shelf and started reading. As I read, I fingered the smooth black stone that the mysterious woman had given me. I had carried the little stone wherever I went, but I did not know either what it was for or how to work it. I had been absorbed in the book for maybe an hour when the sound of someone clearing their throat started me back to reality. Looking up, I saw Naswada standing, nervously, in the shadow of one of the shelves. "Naswada," I said with a smile, even though seeing her made me feel as guilty as possible. I felt responsible for the grief and pain she was forced to endure. The woman in front of me was diminished from the fiery, determined young woman I had met. However, I sensed that she was not destroyed completely by her father's death, but rather coming to terms with it by accepting the leadership and all that entailed. For a busy mind is one that cannot linger on dark things. "Zoe," said Naswada as she moved forward, "I wanted to speak to you." "About what?" I asked as I slipped the book back onto its shelf. "Are you going with Iragan to do Weldonvarden?" For a moment I was surprised, but I quickly mastered it. "I hope to. Brahm and I agreed that both the dwarves and the Varden may appreciate having someone impartial present for Iragan's training." Stopping to look at her, I asked curiously, "Why do you ask?" Naswada stroked the cover of a book left open on a table. "I merely wondered. I appreciate your advice and support, but I understand your reasons for traveling with Ryder Iragan." The formality in her words made me raise my eyebrows. "Naswada, we are friends. Speak plainly with me." Her eyes, wide with shock, met mine for a second, and then she quickly dropped her gaze back to the book. "I am sorry, Zoe," I asked because I truly would appreciate your advice and support in the coming months. I do not know if I am capable of leading the Varden and maintain control over them like my father." Moving closer to her, I rested a hand on her shoulder lightly. "Listen to me, Naswada." My voice was firm. I wanted there to be no misunderstandings about what I was saying. "You are your father's daughter. If anyone has the strength and determination it will take to lead the Varden, it is you. Besides," I smiled as she raised her face to look at me, "you are not alone. Brahm is beside you, and so is Murtagh. Jormundur is a worthy ally as well. If you assert yourself as leader, then the council will accept you." "I am still unsure if I am ready for this responsibility, Zoe. We always are unsure. It is only until we try and do our best that we know for sure if we were ready for the challenge." Naswada nodded her head and drew herself back up. I stepped back and smiled at her as she regained her composure. The insecurities, fear, and pain faded from her as she nodded her head to me. "You are right, Zoe." I shrugged. "The only steps that matter are the ones we take all by ourselves, Naswada. I am sure you will do fine. Your deeds will be sung of through the ages." "You are very sure of it," said Naswada with a small, weak smile. "It's like you know the future, Zoe." I laughed a little. If only she knew. "Who knows?" I said with a playful smirk. Swada joined in my laughter and left a moment later. I watched her go, hating myself for causing her grief. If I had only remained closer to Ajahad. "No," I snapped to myself. "You cannot linger in the past. What is done is done. Now you must make sure Brahm knows what to do." I left the library and found myself walking towards Brahm's study. I needed to tell him a few things. The first was to watch Murtagh with his very life. I was going to say that until I was blue in the face if I had to. I did not want one single hair on that boy's head harmed, nor did I want his true identity getting out. The second thing that needed discussion was the Black Hand, Galbatorix's spy organization. There was no Elva, or at least no Elva yet, to watch Naswada this time and make sure she was not assassinated. This meant Brahm was going to have set up magical wards around Naswada and start to ferret out the organization himself when they reached Surda. I was fairly certain that after years spent escaping assassination himself, that Brahm would be more than up to this challenge. He had, after all, been in love with the original Black Hand. If anyone knew the way they operated, it was Brahm. I was halfway to the study when I encountered Arya. The elf was standing very still, looking out one of the open arches that lined the eastern side of the passage. She turned when she heard my footsteps, and we greeted each other. When I told her that I was on my way to see Brahm, the elf nodded. "I shall walk with you," said Arya. Sensing that the elf would say more when she was ready to, I said nothing as we walked down the nearly deserted corridors. The only people we saw were dwarves who were busily going about their various tasks. At last, after many long minutes of silence, Arya said, "Brahm said you planned to travel with Eragon, and I to do Weldenvarden." "Yes," I said, skirting around a dwarf who was laden with scrolls. "Do you object?" "No," said Arya. "I will enjoy your company, especially when we reach my homeland. I merely wondered." "Ah," I said, and again silence fell. "Is Naswada a choice you support?" said Arya suddenly. We were a few feet away from the entrance to the study. Two blank-faced guards stood at the entrance to the door. They looked neither left nor right, but stood like statues. "Yes," I said, meeting her fierce gaze. "She is." "Why?" Arya did not demand an answer, but she wanted one. Her eyes never left mine, and had I not been used to such forceful gazes, I might have fidgeted, as it was I merely gazed back steadily. "Arya, one of the great trials of knowing what I know is that people come to rely on me for advice instead of trusting themselves. People ask me what course of action is the right one instead of trusting their own hearts and minds. If I say she is, then people will relax and become complacent, as if the task at hand is already complete. Look to your own heart and see if you know the answer." Arya was silent until she nodded her head in understanding. "You are right. I cannot always look to you for confirmation that an action or event is the right one. I must maintain my own opinions and act as I would if you were not at hand." I breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Arya. Until later, Zoe of Angard and La." My heart twinged at the sound of my title, but merely nodded, and Arya left while I gently knocked on the door. Brahm's familiar voice saying, "Enter," made me smile, and I opened the door. I hoped that Brahm could become my ally in this, for he was not supposed to be here anyways, just like me. Perhaps the both of us combined could be enough to keep this world on track. 32. A Funeral. Hi everyone. I want to say that I have really stuck to the book in this chapter, and it is not very exciting, but it will pick up soon. Don't worry. I also want to say thank you to Issy Writer, Galen Katniss, and Leehumberly for adding this story to their alerts. Also big thank you to everyone who reviewed. Please keep reviewing, it's awesome. In response to a guest review, I hope to continue this story through to the end of the series. I am already into Eldest, and so we will see how it goes. With any luck, I can keep updating on a regular basis, and people will continue to want to read this story. All right, on with the story. I was standing in front of a door in an empty corridor. Open arches overlooked a beautiful garden where a fountain tinkled gently and flowers filled the air with their heady perfume. A sense of peace filled the air and made me feel light like a feather about to be blown away by the breeze. I was dressed in a gown of light blue silk, and atop my hair was a thin circlet of silver. The circlet, I was sure of it, had its own power, and while it was too tight as to be uncomfortable, it made itself known. I had no control over my body, and so I did not know why I spoke the following words. "Earmund, open up." I snapped at the closed door. Silence, and so I raised a fist and pounded on the door, the banging disrupting the tranquility of this place. "Hurry up." I snapped at the wood. "I don't have all day." "Why?" came Earmund's muffled voice. "Should I open that door just to be lectured by you?" "Because," I said furiously, "you need to be lectured. Anyone who goes and does what you do needs one. Leave off, Zoe." "No." My dream self seemed quite determined to remain in front of this door and argue with my younger brother. The part of me that was still anchored to my living and breathing body was confused by the entire situation. Suddenly, the door was yanked open to reveal a large, beautiful bedchamber. The room was bright with sunlight that streamed inside. A rounded balcony emerged from one side of the room and overlooked the city that was spread out below, too far away for the noise to reach the peace and quiet of this room, all framed by heavy silver curtains. In the distance, I could see mountains rising upwards, their peaks covered in snow, from the wide-open grasslands swept up to them. An oversized bed laid at the center of the room, its silvery covers shining brightly in the sunlight. A desk and few tall bookcases were on one side of the room. A large fireplace was on the opposite side. Eamund stood in front of me. He was dressed simply in soft grey, and no weapons hung at his side. From the slight redness around his eyes, I wondered if he had been crying, a suspicion that was confirmed a minute later when he sniffed. "Well?" he asked. His voice had lost its force, and so the word came out softly with an almost defeated note to it. The deep depths of his grey eyes dark with pain, and I thought he had never looked more insecure or lost than he did right then. My irritation with my youngest brother vanished, and I slipped past him into the room. Eamund closed the door and turned to face me. "Why, Eamund?" I asked. "Why didn't you tell her?" "Because I can't," snapped Eamund as he flopped onto his bed. "I cannot ask her." "I think if you did, you might be surprised by the answer," I said gently as I sat beside him. "All Iliamwe does is talk about you. Besides," I said bracingly, "if you don't, then you will always regret it." Eamund raised his eyes to mine. "Do you actually think she might say yes?" The swirling depths of his eyes lighting up with hope. I smiled. "I think so. The two of you are quite the set of love birds." Eamund colored slightly. "Don't you dare tell Pethud or Lucia. I'll never hear the end of it." Reining in my amusement, I said, "I promise. Now go and ask her." I rose and yanked my brother up. "The feast is tonight." Eamund smiled at me and in a sly voice asked, "Do you have someone to accompany tonight, sister dear?" I shrugged my shoulders innocently. "Who knows?" I winked at my brother. "But if I do, it is not something I am going to tell you." Eamund laughed, and the two of us left his bedchamber. The dream changed, and I found myself standing on a moonlit balcony. Above me, a full moon cast its cold light down on the palace and the city below it. The light made the white walls of my home shine brilliantly like a beacon. I was wearing my fighting gear and a couple pieces of light armor. My body ached, and I noticed a bandage wrapped tightly around my upper arm. I must have just come from a fight, for my weapons were still at my side. "He will be fine," came a voice from behind me. I turned, wincing as the movement sent pain flaring through my body. A man with dark hair and wearing the simple robes of what I assumed were a healer was standing at the entrance to the balcony looking at me. Behind him, I could see the brightly lit healing halls where beds lined one side of the wall. Many of those beds were full, and I wondered why. The healer continued, "His wounds are grave, but he should recover. The only concern is the residual poison in the wound." Who was injured? I did not remember. A name came to me as I inclined my head in thanks. This was Salma, a long-time family friend and healer for my family. He had been the one to patch us back together after childhood expeditions went awry, and now, when we returned injured from patrols. "Thank you, Salma." My voice sounded exhausted, and I rested my back against the stone railing of the balcony, using the railing as a support to keep myself upright. The man smiled and rested a hand gently on my shoulder. "Your wounds have not yet been tended, Zoe. Come. Pethod will be well, and Eamund is already speaking with your father. There is time for you to be cared for." I nodded and followed him back inside from the balcony. I glanced backwards just before I entered the warm, clean healing hall. There was something dark to the north that made me shiver as if a shadow was slowly covering the world. I woke quite suddenly. My breathing eased as I found myself back in my room in Farthen-Dur. I closed my eyes and remembered the two dreams that had come to me that night. It seemed that the best place for my memories to return was in my dreams. These were not the first memories that had come back to me this way, and I now expected it every time I went to sleep. Glancing out the window, I decided to rise. It was still early, too early for most of Farthen-Dur to be up and about, but today was the day that Ajahad would be laid to rest. Tomorrow I would be leaving with Iragan, Saphira, and Arya for Du Weldenvarden. The last 2 days had not been particularly busy for me specifically, but extremely busy for Brahm. Iragan and Saphira had also been rather occupied, first by visiting Hrothgar, where Saphira had made her promise to repair the star sapphire, and then by Brahm, who had, in a last-ditch effort, made Iragan spend as much time as was physically possible in the library reading books that Brahm assigned. The old storyteller wanted his young student to be absolutely up to standards before being sent off to the elves. Just goes to show you that the old man is still competitive. I think Aragon had enjoyed the challenge, if only because it provided him with a chance to avoid the Council of Elders. Murtagh had also been at loose ends. The two of us had spent time exploring the vast corridors, gardens, chambers, and libraries of the city mountain. It had been fun, a chance to learn more about the other's interests in a more normal, relaxed setting than the one we had had on the back of horse as we outrode enemy soldiers. I had also been called to a private audience with King Hrothgar, who had approved of my offer to act as a dwarven representative in Du Weldenvarden. My afternoons were spent in the stable with my mare. I took her out for short, bareback rides outside of the city. I had enjoyed the chance to be alone with my horse and away from the sorrow that lingered in the city. Melinlas had also enjoyed it, if only because it was a chance to escape her stall and play outside. I would miss my faithful little mare, even though Murtagh had promised to look after her for me. I left the warmth of my bed and walked to the window, brushing aside the thin curtain as I did so. I still had to pack, and I still did not know what I was going to be wearing at the upcoming funeral. Turning back, I examined the pile of possessions I had stacked on the desk and went through my inventory of stuff. One bag, had to get new one from dwarves because my old one was worn out. 4 books, they were definitely coming with me. They were all I had left of that old life where I had been a high school student on Earth. The pages and bindings were worn, but I had done my best to protect them. A scribbler and assorted pens and pencils. I had mastered the art of using a quill and ink, but pens were definitely superior. Small pot and utensils, coming because of how useful they were, and they were easy to transport anyways. Half-full bag of coins, coming for obvious reasons. Blue shirt. It was a thin, dark blue shirt that had been sent with me when I first arrived. I had used it quite a bit, and the poor thing really needed to be thrown out, but I didn't want to. It had been with me since the start of the journey, and leaving it behind did not sit well with me. One set of my comfy, padded black leather clothing, the other set had been ruined in the battle and the patrols that followed. I had had my remaining set repaired by the Varden seamstresses, who did an excellent job, and I hoped the clothing would last me a little while longer. It was excellent for traveling and fighting in skirmishes. However, there was no way it would be acceptable for a formal funeral. A spare pair of boots. They had been in my original bag on arrival. The simple tunic nightshirt thing that Arya had lent me for sleeping, I was currently wearing it. The cloth was a soft dove grey, and I suspected that she had brought it from Du Weldenvarden. A clean tunic of blue cloth and grey leggings that had been given to me by the Varden when I returned from patrols after the battle. A few odds and ends that I had picked up along the road, like my thick black cloak, and a pair of gloves rounded it all out. Efficiently packing it into the small bag that I had been given, I left the bag on the desk, and then quickly stripped off my nightshirt and stepped into the bath that was waiting for me. The dwarves had designed an ingenious system with hot water springs, gravitational flow, and pipes that allowed for constant hot water baths. It was a luxury I would soon miss. Once I was clean, I wrapped myself in towels and returned to my room to curl up in an armchair with one of my old books from Earth. My nose firmly buried in its pages, I spent a delightful half an hour immersed in the story of the Fellowship of the Ring. It is always nice to read about people in an even more daunting, hopeless situation. Puts things in perspective, you know. My reading was interrupted by Arya, who, after receiving no answer to her gentle knock, opened the door. She smiled when she saw me, still wrapped in towels, with a book. "Good morning, Zoe," said the elf, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. I smiled at her and said, "How goes?" She raised her eyebrows at my grammar, but said nothing, just raised her arm so that I could see some clothing items draped over it. "I thought you may need some appropriate clothing for Ajahad's funeral." Her eyes momentarily darkened at the mention of the events that were to take place that day. I nodded and stood, placing my book on the table by my nearly completely packed bag. I took the garments from Arya. There was a pair of silvery leggings, a thin white shirt with silver embroidery along the cuffs and collar, and then a beautifully embroidered silver over tunic. A border of twirling vines done in dark blue thread edged the tunic. Along with it was a simple light brown belt and equally simple silver circular buckle. A pair of soft grey boots that came to just below my knees completed the outfit. The cloth was fine and so soft it might have been cashmere, and that they were of elf make was obvious. I raised my eyes to Arya in a silent question. The elf shrugged. They used to belong to Glenwing, but I took the liberty to tailor them to you using magic. I stared at Arya for a long moment. That she would gift me with the clothes that had once belonged to a dear companion stunned me. I rested a hand on her shoulder. I said softly in the ancient language, "Thank you, Arya Svitkona." Arya smiled, the shadow of grief lifting from her eyes as she nodded towards the clothes. "Put them on. I am not sure if they will fit even after my adjustments, and we will be needed soon." Unable to contain a girlish grin, I went into the bathroom and quickly donned my undergarments, which included my earth bra. The poor seamstress was pretty stunned by it, and then slipped the shirt and leggings on. Arya had managed, somehow, to get the clothes to fit me perfectly. I pulled the boots on and then went back to my room. Arya examined me critically and then said, "Put the tunic on." I compiled and stood still as she made a few minor adjustments before nodding, satisfied by the result. "I'll leave you now, for I must prepare as well. Also, Murtagh wanted me tell you that he will meet you at the funeral." I noticed the faint smirk that played around her lips. Murtagh and I were in for some teasing. Our relationship was getting to the point where it was impossible to keep it under wraps. "Lovely. Thank you, Arya," I said with all my heart, and to both Arya and my own surprise, I threw my arms around the elf and hugged her. Arya stood stiffly for a moment before relaxing, and I drew back. "You are welcome, friend," said the elf in the ancient language, and with that she left. With Arya gone, I quickly brushed out my dark hair. The thick black tresses were a difficult thing to style into anything too complicated. Examining my reflection in the polished mirror, I allowed my fingers to remember a forgotten hairstyle. The final result, a style that I must have used in my old life, was a braided updo that kept the hair from my face and off the back of my neck. Satisfied, I slipped my sword from its wide leather belt onto the much thinner one that Arya had left. I had carefully cleaned the blade the previous evening, and the diamond in the center of the pommel glittered. I examined the vines that twined around the hilt and wondered, for I still did not know, how the sword had come to be mine. I also did not know what its name was, for I still could not remember what the runes inscribed on its hilt meant. Following my sword, I buckled my recently cleaned and wrist-stocked quiver and bow. My hand lingered on my lion-shaped horn. It frustrated me to be unable to read the runes when I knew I could. I gently stroked the marks on the side of the white horn, but no matter how hard I concentrated, the information remained stupidly far away. I sighed, annoyed by it, and then left my room. Arya must already have dressed and left, for I did not see her, and so I left the apartment that was shared between Arya, Murtagh, and I, as I walked down the corridor towards the place where I supposed to meet Brahm, Murtagh, and the rest of the entourage that would follow Ajahad to his final resting place. I saw no one. The city was deathly silent as it had been when I ridden Melinlas to try and intercept Durza. I finally encountered people as I made my way to Trondheim's south gate. They all made way for me, and it did not take long for me to reach the thick gate where the funeral procession would begin. Seeing my friends gathered on the side of the street, I made my way to them. Murtagh glanced up from where he was standing beside Iragan and Saphira to see Zoe making her way towards them. Murtagh felt his mouth drop open in amazement as he stared at her. She was dressed in fine silvery clothes that made her grey-blue eyes stand out. Her thick black hair was braided up, but the most surprising and striking thing was the way she seemed to glow. A faint light seemed to come from her as she cut a path through the crowds of dwarves and humans. The glow seemed to warm the coldness that hung around the gathered throng and made the young woman look far more regal and noble than ever before. Iragan nudged him in the ribs and said with an amused smirk, "Zoe is certainly getting looked at." It was true, noted Murtagh with displeasure. As Zoe passed by, people, whether they were a hardened soldier or a dwarven matron, stared at her. Not that Zoe seemed to mind. Rather, she acted as if she was impervious to the wondering stares and whispers that accompanied her. She reached them, and greetings were exchanged, before silence fell over the small group of friends. Brahm was a little ways away talking with Jormundur and three other obviously important members of the Varden. Auric had left to join his king, who was surrounded by dwarves. Arya was beside Saphira, dressed in black and looking as aloof as always. Naswada, grave, sable-cloaked, and strong in stature, though tears glimmered on her proud face, was close behind the body of her father. Ajahad himself was at the front of a column that was being formed. He was cold and pale on a white marble bier borne by 6 men in black armor. Upon his head was a helm strewn with precious stones, and his hands were folded over his chest, and the ivory hilt of his sword. Silver mail glimmered along with his shining shield. Murtagh was gestured into line beside Zoe and Arya. They were behind Eragon and Saphira, who were in turn behind Brahm, the council of elders, and Naswada. Murtagh glanced around. He felt uneasy, even though he, as a close friend of Eragon and Brahm, was given a spot of honor away from the vast majority of the Varden. The crowd, so silent and depressed, made the young man feel uneasy. A warm hand slipped into his and gave it a gentle squeeze. Glancing down, he saw Zoe's small, thin fingers intertwined with his large, rough, and scarred ones. Looking at her face briefly, he returned his gaze forward and squeezed back. Despite the sadness and grief that made the atmosphere so chilled it seemed as if a warm bubble surrounded him when Zoe held his hand. Yet, despite the impassive expression on her face, he knew her well enough to see the remorse and pain that she felt. So Murtagh, someone who had rarely given or received comfort, did his best to comfort her by offering his hand. He knew that Arya would see along with Brahm, Eragon, and Saphira, as well as many of the Varden, but right then he did not care. Let them see. Together, with his half-brother in front of him and Zoe beside him along with Arya, who he had come to count as a friend, they waited. For what, Murtagh did not know. All the lanterns were shuttered halfway so that a cool twilight suffused the air. No one seemed to move or breathe. A single plume of incense drifted from the bier, winding its way towards the hazy ceiling of the hollow mountain. Suddenly, the sound so loud it seemed to reverberate through his bones, came the sound of a drum. Boom! The note echoed on, and on making the vast city mountain reverberate with the sound long after it had ended. The note signaled movement, and so, with deliberate slowness, the procession which stretched for a mile outside of the city moved forward. One step closer, thought Murtagh as he gripped Zoe's hand tightly. Boom! This time a second drum, the sound lighter, melded with the first. This note seemed to summon bittersweet hope, while the first summoned grief. The force of the sound propelled them along at a slow but purposeful pace. Just like life, thought Murtagh, we move forward to some tune as our destiny plays out around us. Boom! When the tunnel ended, Ajahad's bearers paused between the onyx pillars before gliding into the central chamber. If it was possible, the dwarves seemed to grow more solemn as they gazed on the wreckage that was the star jewel. Even Murtagh felt a twinge of sadness as he observed the shattered beauty of the jewel. Boom! They were walking through a graveyard of shattered rose-colored jewel. Some of the pieces were taller than Saphira, and on some you could still make out the delicate carvings of a petal. The path that had been cleared for the procession led to one of the large tunnels that lead underground. Boom! They walked forward and entered the underground world. Through caverns they marched, passing stone huts where dwarven children clutched their mothers and stared with wide eyes at the procession. Boom! The final note of the drums signaled the end of this journey. They halted under ribbed stalactites that branched over a great catacomb lined with alcoves. In each alcove lay a tomb carved with a name and clan crest. From what Murtagh could see in the dim light, there were thousands, hundreds of thousands, buried here. Idea of being surrounded by dead dwarf ghosts sent shivers up his spine. Zoe's hand tightened around his briefly. After a moment of silent reflection, the bearers strode forward into a small room that was separate from the main chamber. In the center, on a raised platform, was an open crypt. On the top of the stone, carved in both Dwarvish, Common, and the ancient language, were the words, "May all Nerlin, humans and elves, remember this man, for he was noble, strong, and wise. Gunter Aruna." When they were gathered around the crypt, Ajahad was lowered into the crypt, and those that had known him personally were allowed to approach. Murtagh, just behind Zoe, who he had been forced to let go, was eighth in line. When his turn came, the young man stepped up alongside the tomb. It was the first time Murtagh had ever attended a funeral. There had been no time for Tornax, and he had been too young to really remember his mother's funeral as anything more than stern-looking people and black robes. Looking downwards at the still, peaceful face of the man, Murtagh wondered if Ajahad had known that he was the son of Morzan. Had Ajahad known who he was? Had he known that the son of Morzan was listening to their counsels and fighting beside him? Or had he decided to let it be as a sign of respect towards Brahm? Three things struck Murtagh then. The first was that he truly had respected this man, and that his death was a painful blow not only to the Varden, but to Murtagh. Ajahad had been a leader, a strong opposition to everything that Galbatorix represented. The second was that, at his funeral, he would rather not be buried among stone, but somewhere open and free. The third was that he did not know what to say. Desperate to say something and leave this suffocating, death-filled place, Murtagh spoke softly. "Peace be with you, Ajahad of the Varden." Swiftly, Murtagh rejoined Zoe, who was gazing blankly at the tomb, her eyes swirling with emotions. Beside her stood Arya, along with Iragan, Saphira, and Brahm, all of who were wearing suitably remorseful expressions. Stepping beside Zoe, Murtagh slipped his hand back into hers, offering both his strength and wanting to feel the warmth of living flesh. This was no place for the living. The last person to ascend to the crypt was Naswada. As she bent over the edge of the crypt and took her father's hand, Murtagh truly looked at her. He had not bothered to really look at her when they had met in the library that day, and now, knowing that she had fought alongside the Varden in the battle, Murtagh felt a growing sense of respect for her. She was not the sheltered, manipulative girl he had thought she was, and now she had to become a leader. For that, for her acceptance and determination to accomplish the task in front of her, and Zoe's own words about her character, Murtagh respected her. Murtagh winced as Naswada began to sing a funeral lamentation. The sound was high and piercing. It filled the cavern and echoed on and on. Then came 12 dwarves who slid a marble slab over Ajahad's upturned face. It was such a simple thing. The sliding of a piece of stone, the fading of Naswada's voice, and then he was gone. Ajahad of the Varden was gone, and in his place was his daughter. Already she seemed to be preparing herself, moving onwards and bottling her grief for a more appropriate time. Naswada rose, her face set, her eyes dry and her posture rigidly straight and determined. She looked down at them as if daring all gathered to think less of her. The sight of her so defiant made Murtagh smiled inwardly. She would do. Naswada was a survivor. He could relate, for he, Murtagh son of Morzan, was also a survivor.